I'm James Richardson, and my story begins in the office of Dr. Nancy Royce, the court-appointed counselor. Where to start? Okay, Doc. I think I know. It's when I heard the sound of a scream over the loud whirring of the table saw while working in the basement building some shelves. As I began running up the stairs, I saw my daughter Sarah already running down the hallway on her way to the front door. I wasn't sure where the scream came from, but figured that Sarah had a better idea than I did since she had been in the family room on the first floor talking on the phone. At 45, it took me a while to catch up to my 18-year-old daughter, but the source of the scream came into view as I rushed out the front screen door. There at our mailbox near the street stood my 42-year-old loving wife of 21 years, waving a large envelope and some kind of laminated oversized ticket over her head. I also noticed a camera crew running in the direction of my wife from a van parked across the street. Being a Saturday, it seemed that every one of our neighbors were home and now standing on their own lawns and porches watching my wife screaming and screeching. I was confused to say the least. I finally joined my daughter on the front lawn while Kathy continued to jump up and down while working in the occasional spin. I believe in competitive figure skating they call those moves double and triple axels. She was still screaming, but now we noticed that she was laughing the entire time, which set our minds at ease somewhat, but did little to explain what was going on. Upon spotting me for the first time since I arrived on the lawn, Kathy screamed my name while running up to me, wrapped her arms around my neck, and kissed me hard on the lips. Truth be told, despite the fact that Kathy means the world to me, her little public display was the closest thing to sex we've had in a couple of months, if not longer. She just hadn't seemed interested in being intimate with me lately, and I didn't know why. Maybe we were just in a rut, but, well, I'm getting sidetracked. My daughter looked on, simply asking in a confused tone, "Mom?" Not noticing her daughter until that moment, Kathy called out, "Oh, Sarah, I can't believe it's happened. I mean, it's really happened." The camera crew kept taping while Sarah asked, "What are you talking about, Mom?" "World's watching. I've been chosen to be on the show. Oh my God, I've been selected to be on WW." I glanced at the camera crew and a couple of others trailing behind holding clipboards and briefcases and saw they were all wearing ITN shirts, jackets, and caps. ITN was the network that aired World's Watching. It suddenly occurred to me what my wife was so excited about. Kathy was a big fan of the reality show, World's Watching, and they apparently had chosen her to participate. Of course, fans of the show usually refer to it as WW, while the network promos always refer to it as World's Favorite Reality Show. Whether that was true or not, I don't know, nor do I really care. What I did know was that Kathy was one of those people who was that big fan. Certainly the biggest fan in the neighborhood and quite possibly the entire state. If in fact she was chosen to take part in her favorite show, it would go a long way in explaining the screaming as well as the camera crew. Mystery solved. The camera crew kept taping my wife's celebration while my daughter and I looked on in confusion and a bit of trepidation. I knew the basics of the so-called game from having watched it so many times with Kathy. The game was easy enough to figure out. Of course, any TV game show is easy to figure out after watching it with your wife for 15 years. During the course of each show, she would explain every bit of strategy and every last nuance. Basically, they put 16 strangers into a house built into a soundstage on a studio lot. I think it's 16, but again, who really cares? Then every week they vote out at least one house guest, yet the show is on 3 times a week. The person voted out on eviction night then gets sent home. Unless they're one of the last 8 standing, then they're sent to the pier house. This is another house in a secret location where the ousted guests have a sort of mini vacation while waiting to vote for the winner from the final 2 remaining guests in the show's finale. There are competitions during the week where the winner becomes house leader. This person then puts up 2 candidates to be voted off. Now that I think about it, maybe the rules of the game aren't all that simple, but it doesn't really matter. My relating this story certainly isn't going to be a recap of that fateful season that changed my family's life forever. The game itself really isn't that important for the moment, never was, but as long as I've begun to describe the rules, I'll finish. Anyway, these competitions can be either physical or mental. I knew she could do well in anything mental, but Kathy is about athletic as a sack of wheat. But winning the competitions isn't always necessary. If someone get in a good alliance, they can go quite far, even win if they play their cards right. Oh, I forgot to mention that there are cameras and microphones hidden all over the house. They don't miss a trick either. The cameras zoom in whether you're in the kitchen, the bedrooms, or the shower. Aside from the week's house leader, who gets a room of their own, the other bedrooms are shared by 4 or 5 house guests. I will say the microphones they use are impressive. Even though many on the show whisper, the microphones pick up their voices as if they were speaking in normal tones and reveal all of the backstabbing, deceit, and betrayal that the show is known for. It was these factors that would cause my world to crash down around me. Eventually, we all moved into the house where the fine folks from AITA placed contracts down in front of my wife to sign. I immediately asked if we could have a few minutes to talk about it first. To their credit, they all stepped out of the kitchen and onto the deck, but it was obvious that they knew that Kathy was eventually going to sign on the dotted line no matter what I said. My daughter and I were the only ones who thought otherwise. I started the conversation, but I'm not sure that my wife knew I was even talking. My daughter didn't have much luck either. Look, Han, I know you're a big fan of this show and all, but I have reservations about you doing this. Yeah, Mom. This is my last summer before going to college, and I was really looking forward to doing a lot of mother-daughter things. Kathy just frowned and said, I was expecting my family to be a little more supportive. I mean, this is a dream come true. You know I never miss an episode, and this is my chance to be on it. Don't you understand? Of course I understand, Han. We both do. But you have to see where we're coming from also. We'll both miss you. Hell, you could be on the show for almost 3 months. She giggled. You just don't want to see me hanging around those cute young guys they have on the show. My daughter looked back at me waiting for me to reply to her mother, and I did so as honestly as I could. I'm not thrilled about it if you want to know the truth. Is my husband jealous? I nodded. You know I am. Always have been. Don't you trust me? It's not that I don't trust you. I just don't trust other men. If you haven't noticed, there are some men that don't respect others' marriages. Oh, honey, I'll miss you too, the both of you, but you'll be okay. And Sarah, I'll make it up to you. I promise. Sarah wasn't giving up either as she replied, This is my last summer at home, Mother. If you're serious about being on the show for as long as you say you are, I'll already have left for school in May. When do you plan to make it up to me? After I'm married? Whenever Sarah called Kathy Mother, I knew she was exasperated with her. Kathy began talking about what she needed to take with her as if Sarah and I never uttered a word. I'll have to buy new underwear and bring some shorts and tanks and a swimsuit as well. I have to be prepared to turn some heads if you know what I mean. I glared at her. What do you mean turn some heads? She giggled. I will probably have to dress sexy to attract some attention is all. Being on the show is great, but I plan on playing it to the best of my ability. I always said that if I ever had the chance to be on the show that I would do almost anything it takes to win it all. What the hell are you talking about? I was getting angry because it certainly didn't seem like she was kidding around. She smiled, but there was something about it that was almost sinister as she replied, I guess everything depends who wants me in their alliance and what it's going to take to be the last one standing. I was ready to explode as I raised my voice. Jesus Christ, Kathy, I don't think you're kidding. Don't worry, sweetheart. I promise not to get into a full-blown showmance or anything, but if I can get what I want with a little teasing, then why not? Sarah was appalled. Mom, you don't mean you would actually consider hooking up with someone other than Daddy, do you? No, Sarah. Like I said, maybe just a little teasing is all. It's just part of the game. Doesn't sound like much of a game to me. What if there is some guy that wants to kiss you or something? That would just kill Dad. It wouldn't do much for me either. Kathy backtracked a bit and said, I don't think that it would come to that, Sarah. I love your father too much to do anything that would hurt him. Besides, it's just a TV show, and I'm sure they wouldn't put anyone on there that would take advantage of an old married woman like me. It's all in the name of fun. I broke in saying, What do you mean you don't think it will come to that? It still sounds like you would do anything to win, just like you said before. No, darling. I said I'd do almost anything to win, and that still goes. You don't realize that this is a chance of a lifetime for me. I noticed you still haven't explained what you meant when you said you didn't think it would come to that, meaning kissing some guy. Oh, honey, don't be ridiculous. Just think of what we can do with the extra money. We don't need any extra money. What do you want that you don't already have? She smiled and answered, We'll think of something once I win the $500,000. Don't you think that $500,000 is important? I shook my head and sharply replied, Not as important as our marriage and family. And you're certainly avoiding my other question, aren't you? She didn't respond. I wasn't even sure she was listening any longer. It was as if someone replaced my wife with a self-absorbed, insensitive, and unsympathetic carbon copy. How was this even possible? So it wasn't a surprise when my wife wound up ignoring my pleas, and once the network people returned through the sliding doors from the back deck, my wife wasted no time in signing the contract, thus sealing the deal. Our daughter and I could only shake our heads at the blatant disrespect that Kathy was showing for our family. Kathy was on cloud nine, while we were both much less enthused. It was obvious that Kathy was getting swept away with the glitz and glamour of going to Hollywood and appearing on a television show. The woman rep from AITA then says, You know, we have difficulty signing up, let's just say. mature housewives to appear on the show. Most of the time they're leery of what their husbands would think of seeing their wives on a national television show surrounded by younger, single men who are sometimes looking to hook up with someone. As you know, we call that a showmance, and those things are very popular with our fans. You're certainly a very open-minded man, Mr. Richardson. You couldn't be more wrong, sister. She smiled, barely acknowledging my response as she continued. We at ITN always wonder what would happen if a faithful wife strayed while on our show. It's never happened, but it would be interesting, don't you think? I made no reply. If I did, I would be using words that would be considered less than acceptable while addressing a lady. One thing that was abundantly clear was she conveniently made sure my wife signed the contract before telling me this latest tidbit. She then added, with no real remorse I might add, but I'm sure that won't happen in this case. You should be very proud of your wife. Mrs. Richardson is a very attractive woman, wife and mother. With her long blonde hair and petite body, she looks much younger than her early 40s. She could easily pass for her late 20s. I'd be shocked if one of the younger guys we signed for the show didn't come on to her, and I don't just mean gameplay. But Mrs. Richardson has a pretty good head on her shoulders, and appears that she just might be one of the stronger players this season. Looks to me like she's loaded for bear, and isn't about to let anything or anybody get in her way of winning $500,000. I replied sarcastically. Yeah, I noticed. Not even her family can stop her, right? Well, me, Richardson, you're married to quite a woman and quite the little dynamo, I might add. She's a fine addition to our show and quite a head-turner. I wouldn't be surprised if our numbers improve just by having her on, and if she makes it closer to the end, all the better for us. But in the end, you probably don't have anything to worry about. Probably? All I could think was, did she just tell me that I probably don't have anything to worry about? Was she kidding me? Probably? The woman from the network then told us that we will be receiving the cable feed every night at 10 o'clock for free. It was an additional 2 hours of the show that, since it's on cable, tends to allow some of the more risque language and actions. She said, they don't show it all, but they do allow quite a bit more to be aired. More so than the network broadcast. Allow more of what? I asked. You know, some salty language and some of the steamier scenes if there's a showmance. I just stared at her in disbelief, wanting to pick her up and throw her back onto her van. She then added, Cathes says you watch the show with her, so you probably already know that a showmance is? Yeah, I'm quite aware what that is. Seeing my discomfort with the topic, she collected her paperwork and stuffed it into her briefcase, and all the while this was going on, my wife sat at the table looking over her itinerary, which included being picked up by a limo early Monday morning and whisked away to the airport for her flight to LAX. We weren't even going to see her to the airport. This was going to be tough on Sarah and myself, but Kathy didn't seem fazed in the least. The argument could be made that she looked thrilled to not only be appearing on the show, but also getting away from her family for a while. It was hard to say exactly what she was thinking because she had never acted this way before. She was caught up in a fantasy world, and I feared that the head on her shoulders was not quite what it was an hour ago. During that short period of time, she had changed, and not for the better. The ink wasn't even dry as the network team began packing up and making their way to our front door. One of the women turned to my wife and said, Then I can tell my executive producer that you're all in and plan on playing the game the way it was meant to be played? Kathy quickly answered, Absolutely. I can hardly wait. Kathy then turned to me and added, Just remember not to get too jealous, James. This is just a game. The woman simply replied, That a girl. You've got your plane ticket, so we'll see you on Monday. Enjoy your last day and a half with your family, and be prepared for the greatest experience of your life, with the exception of being with your husband, of course. Kathy giggled, God, I hope it's better than that. I heard what she said and wasn't sure if I was more hurt or pissed at that moment. Now looking back, I'd have to say I was more pissed. She then followed the network people to the van, all the while discussing some last-minute details about the show. The rest of the weekend was tense. Once everyone had left, I couldn't help but beg her to stay with her family. I explained that I had a bad feeling about all of this, but she just played it off, saying that she'd be fine and I have nothing to worry about. Later Saturday, she said she had to do some last-minute shopping for the show as well as getting her hair styled. I felt bad for Sarah because Kathy left without asking our daughter if she wanted to tag along. Sunday afternoon, and the tension grew. I wanted to again warn her that one of the guys on the show might try to get fresh with her, but thought better of it. She already knew I'm the jealous type, but assumed she knew it was because I loved her so much. Instead, I reminded her that she's my wife and our daughter's mother, and that she should remember that while she's away from us. Her reply to that was both troubling and confusing. So you don't think I'm attractive enough to turn another man's head, especially a younger man? Do you just think of me as a wife and mother? Is that it? I stood up and walked out of the room before I said or did something stupid. I loved Kathy more than anything in the world, but the way she was approaching the show was troubling. Sarah was speechless, and I guess I was as well. I had a bad feeling about this whole thing, and especially the fact that my loving wife was ignoring our feelings. My wife could always be a bit of a flirt, but as far as I knew, it was only with our friends, and even then I was always there with her, so it never got out of hand. Now she was going to be on her own with no way for me to protect her if need be. Even more disturbing, it seemed, was that she was not only planning on teasing and flirting on the show, she was looking forward to it. I guess most people have a secret fantasy, but most people would never even think of acting on it. If this is her secret fantasy, she planning on making it happen and at her family's expense. It certainly was out of character for her to act this way, so there was still hope that she would snap out of the AW funk she was in before doing something she would later regret. The worst part of all this appeared to be that there was no way to talk any sense into her, and that she was going into a situation she could not control, as much as she thought she could. As for myself, I already felt that I had lost control, and she had yet to leave the house. I had a really bad feeling about this whole world's watching thing, and my fears would soon prove warranted. Monday morning, and Kathy was in the shower with the door locked. I call into her telling her I have to leave for work. Expecting a big kiss and hug from my wife, who I might not see for nearly 3 months, she instead calls out to me that she has to finish getting ready because the limo will be there in an hour. Of course, I heard all this over the sound of running water. Without any effort on her part to show me any remorse to be leaving me behind for possibly 12 weeks, she instead yelled through the door, "I'll see you after I win, W. Love you." It was far from heartfelt. No hug, no kiss, no kidding. Hell, she usually kisses me when she goes to the mailbox, and now I don't get one when she might be away for nearly 3 months? I know she's excited about being on the show, but knowing I couldn't even get a goodbye kiss really affected me. I wasn't sure if I should mention anything to Sarah, but decided that she should be warned that her mother is acting less and less like she normally does, and that maybe she should be prepared for the same treatment. Sarah is up making breakfast, and I tell her what just happened upstairs. She's shocked and hurt for me. She throws her arms around me and says, "I'm sorry, Dad. I wish I knew what got into her. We'll talk about it over supper tonight. Love ya." I smiled the best I could and replied, "I love you too, Pumpkin." By the time I walk out the front door, I felt sick to my stomach. After arriving at work, I was and visited the men's room immediately. When I arrived home that night, I found a message on our answering machine from Kathy. "Hi, James. It's only me. They said I could call you one last time from the limo, so here it is. Didn't want to bother you at work, and to be honest, was afraid you would try to talk me out of being on the show again. I have to stay focused, darling. This is for our future. This is so exciting. I've never been in a limo before, let alone call anyone from it on my way to the airport to jet to LA. Sarah said you were a little upset that I didn't come out of the shower to give you a hug and kiss, but I was in a hurry, as you probably know. Well, gotta go. There are a couple of network people traveling with me, and will be giving me more details on what to expect. See you soon." Wait, not too soon, I hope, if you know what I mean. I want to win this thing. Bye for now, and don't forget to watch tomorrow night at 8. That was it. It almost sounded like one run-on sentence, as if they told her you can say anything you like as long as you can fit it into one breath. Even though we would not be allowed to contact each other until she left the show one way or another, she decided to call home and leave me a brief, insincere message, knowing by the time I listened, she would already be in California. There was also no apology for not kissing me goodbye. Instead, I had to listen to a lame excuse. Well, I was certainly feeling better about the whole world's watching thing, though I was glad she reminded me to watch the show tomorrow night, because until that moment it had slipped my mind. There, that should be facetious enough for you, Doc. Well, it was Tuesday, the night of the first show. A part of me couldn't wait to see my wife. I wanted her to do well while living out her dream of being on her favorite TV show. I was just leery of how far she was willing to go to do well and live out her dream. I could only wait to see. Some of our friends set up a world's watching party. I had no interest since I hate parties to begin with, but despite all of my best efforts, I got stuck attending. What made it so difficult to avoid was that they arranged for it to be in our living room. At 8 o'clock the show came on, and everyone at the party cheered, along with the studio audience in Los Angeles. I began feeling ill immediately and wasn't quite sure why. It was just a gut feeling, and I've always been a firm believer in going with your gut. The show began, and they began introducing the house guests, one by one. The first time they show the contestants is at their home receiving their ticket into the house. I took a minute, but they finally got around to showing Kathy at our mailbox and in front of our house. Everyone in our living room cheered. It felt really strange to be watching my wife getting our mail on a national television show, but there it was. They showed the brief interview with her where she claims that she's a happily married housewife and mother of a teenage daughter. She briefly went on to say that since she was a big fan of the game and wanted to win more than anything else in the world, that she was prepared to do anything to win. This was said with a sly smile that a so-called happily married woman and mother ought not to have had. Now it was time to go live. They had them wait in the wings before walking out in front of the studio audience for their 15 minutes of fame, as Andy Warhol once suggested. There were only 3 people that seemed to catch my attention. The first was the 10th or 11th person introduced, my wife. She looked beautiful. Then again, she always looks beautiful, so there's no surprise there. God, how I loved that woman. I always felt like the luckiest guy in the world when I was with her. She had the ultimate girl next door look, while I, on the other hand, was only ordinary on my best day. But she always said I was all she ever needed, and up until this freaking game thing started, I believed her. It wasn't long after that first show that I started having my doubts. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, they introduced this young guy from Oklahoma next. His name was Harley, not that I remembered at the time. The guy looked like he might have played college ball. He was almost one solid muscle, and I could be wrong, but I think he wanted to win the game, so he would have enough money to afford a neck. The last guy out was some young guy from Atlanta. If I ever saw a man I hated and wanted to punch in the face first sight, he was it. His name was Jake, and for some reason I remembered it immediately. Something told me that Jake was an arrogant prick right from the get-go. Again, it was just a gut feeling. But then again, everything about the way he presented himself told me I was right. Soon they were all running into the house to select their beds in one of 3 community bedrooms consisting of 5 beds. Not surprisingly, I saw Jake follow Kathy. This did nothing to allay my fears. The guests sat around their living room talking amongst themselves and getting to know one another. Sometimes these contestants lie to give themselves an edge. I was almost waiting for Kathy to say that she is a former exotic dancer who is still single, waiting for Mr. Right. To my relief, she told the other players, guests, housemates, whatever the hell you want to call them, that she was a happily married woman and mother of a daughter who will be starting college in the fall. Actually, she was incorrect. Sarah will start college at the end of summer. She also failed to tell them that if she stays on the show long enough, she may just miss her only daughter leaving for her first year of college. Of course, she failed to mention that her loving husband was less than thrilled to have his wife move away and live with strangers for what could be a quarter of the year. By the end of their first little meet and greet, they all walk into the kitchen and continue to talk. Only this time it's a bit more informal. I wasn't sure if I saw what I thought I did, but I thought I was good old Jake casting his arrogant prick eyes on my Kathy. I wasn't sure how many others caught it, but I knew some had by the way they turned and looked at me. It broke my heart when Sarah turned to me, and I could see in her eyes that she had the same doubts and fears that had been feeling. I just sat stone-faced, wanting to call the network and tell them to get my wife back or else. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I think the overall mood in our living room changed after that, and not for the better. The show continued on, where they had a contest to determine the first house leader. That person got to have their own bedroom for a week. Before going any further, I'd like to remind you that these are adults partaking in these silly activities, my wife included. As the season premiere came to a close, they showed the guests going to their rooms to unpack. The host was then telling the TV audience about the cable feed that they can order from their local provider. The cable show was set to begin immediately following the show on Thursday, so they still had time to order. As they were running the credits, our friends and neighbors began talking amongst themselves and getting ready to leave. My eyes were still glued to the set as I noticed that the arrogant prick named Jake not only had the bed next to my wife, but smiled at the camera as he bumped it over a bit closer to hers. Needless to say, I did not sleep well that first night. Thursday comes along and it's time for the second show. Most of the show is filled with taped footage from Tuesday night through that afternoon. This time it's only family in our living room. Besides Sarah and myself, there is Kathy's sister Vicky, her husband, and Kathy's parents. By the end of the show, I was glad there weren't any others, yet wish her family stayed home as well. Things were about to take a turn for the worse, and even though I had bigger problems on my mind to deal with, every once in a while I recalled that the entire neighborhood was watching. And when they had a station break or promo, they would say the name of the show, which immediately reminded me that world really was watching. How could it not? Not long into the show, house guests began plotting and forming alliances or teams. Hard to believe as it may seem, people were already lining up to stab others in the back. They showed Jake and Harley getting together to form an alliance, and immediately Jake hatched the idea of bringing in the little blonde housewife. Says she'll probably do whatever they want her to do, and that they can probably take her to the final 3. Harley asked Jake if he thinks she can really help them. Jake smirked and replied, "In more ways than one." No one dare look at me this time around. I truly believed they sensed my rage that was quickly becoming a close companion of my sorrow. There was little doubt that they had targeted my wife to not only be an alliance member, but also a possible showmance. There was also little doubt that here wasn't much I could do about it either. By the second week, Jake had already talked to Kathy about joining him and Harley in an alliance, and to say he laid it on thick would be a gross understatement. Speaking in hushed tones to avoid the others hearing, but being picked up quite well by the network microphones, he began by telling how they needed a smart player and someone they could trust, and said they wanted to take her to the end of the game. He then said that she had a great chance to win it all because he actually wanted to be sitting next to her when they vote on the winner, not Harley. She was listening, and I could tell she was falling for his lies. Then he told her that everyone would certainly vote for the pretty wife and mother over him when it came right down to it. She blushed and whispered, "Do you really think I'm pretty?" I could see in his smile that he was thinking that there was a potential for a showmance with my wife. That a-hole was a smooth talker. I'll give him that, and there wasn't a doubt in my mind that he had seduced married women before, and that he was going to do it slow and steady. There wasn't a need for him to rush. She wasn't going anywhere unless she was voted off, and by this time he and Harley were running the house, so that wasn't about to happen anytime soon. He also didn't have to worry about an angry husband, because I couldn't get my hands on him. Looking back, I think he was already getting off rubbing my face in it. Fortunately, it was only Sarah and myself watching. Well, at least in our house, it was only Sarah and myself. Our family, neighbors, and the rest of the world were watching elsewhere. This wasn't too embarrassing, was it? Now my fears were stuck in my throat. But Sarah and I watched every show 3 times a week, and almost a month into the show things began to heat up even more. Until then, Sarah and I noticed the little things that happen when two people first get together. The little touches while talking. The playfulness that usually leads to something not so playful in the bedroom, eyes that lets the other person know there's no doubt what they're thinking about. In addition to all that I've mentioned, Jake had another trick up his sleeve. His seduction mode took on a new technique, and it was both brilliant and evil. This was the week he began to subtly put me down every chance he got. It started Tuesday that week. While everyone else was in the kitchen, Jake roped Kathy off from the herd and was now in the bedroom with her. Whether or not Kathy knew it or not, she was the topic of conversation with the other house guests. They all could see what was going on, and most of the younger ones thought it was funny. A divorced woman on the show, still younger than my wife, seemed genuinely concerned, though she didn't act on it. After seeing Kathy's attitude ever since finding out she was going to be on the show, I believe there was nothing the divorcee could say to get Kathy to stop anyway. Anyhow, they were in the bedroom talking low, and at first it was about gameplay, but that didn't last long as Jake began asking Kathy about me. She spoke well of me for the most part, though every once in a while she would say something that gave him an opening to get a dig in at me. A prime example was when she told him that there were times when she feels like she's taken for granted. He immediately got up and sat with her on her bed. I was none too thrilled to witness this. He then said, "He probably doesn't mean to be like that, Kathy. He doesn't sound like a bad guy. He might be a little too full of himself, but that doesn't make him a bad guy." She nodded. Goddamn it, she actually nodded in agreement. He then added, "Sounds like he just doesn't appreciate what he has." She sniffled a bit and said, "No, he really is a good man. It's just that." Not letting her finish, he jumped in and said, "Wow, if I had a wife as hot as you, I'd never leave the house. I certainly would never let you out my sight." She thanked him. Can you believe it? She basically thanked that arrogant prick for seducing her. Then he took her by the hand and looked into her eyes and said, "Hell, if you were mine, I would never want to leave our bed." She blushed. She obviously forgot all of the objections I raised when this all started. I did everything I could think of to make her stay home. She didn't want to hear any of it. During the show, they showed more of his subtle, and at times not so subtle, seduction of my wife, including a brief hug before they went to bed. By Sunday night, he was practically calling me a loser, and she was defending me as much as she had earlier, which really wasn't all that much at all. The cable show following the network broadcast was even worse. There were more hugs and some light touches that were certainly inappropriate for a married woman to have with anyone other than her husband. I'm not sure she was trying to lead him on, but it sure did appear that way. Anyone watching could see what was happening, and it was making me lose my mind that my own wife couldn't. It was apparent that Kathy was buying into it, his line of bullshit. She sure as hell wasn't standing up for me. Decided right then that I would be having a conversation with the show's producer, Zach, watch his name, the next day. I had to get Kathy off of the show before any more damage was done. So far, I could forgive her for a lot of what was going on, but if it went any further, all bets were off. I couldn't wait around expecting things to change on their own. So I left work at noon on Monday so I could contact the producers of the show. With the 3-hour time difference between coasts, I had to wait until at least noon, and it was killing me. Every minute seemed like an hour as time crept along. I finally got through to Zach Blevins, the executive producer of World's Watching. Our phone conversation did not go well, nor did it bode well for the future. When I told him of my concerns, I pleaded with him to talk to my wife and make her aware that she is putting her marriage in jeopardy by remaining on the show. His response was cold and calculating, but not all that surprising. Tell me, Mr. Richardson, is this an emergency? Is someone sick or dying? If not, I'm afraid there's nothing we can do here at AW. What about my marriage? Doesn't what's happening to my marriage count as an emergency? I'm sorry, Mr. Richardson. I truly am, but my hands are tied. Your wife signed the contract, and unless voted out of the house by the other players or eventually wins, it's solely her decision whether to stay or leave. But that's what I mean. Couldn't you at least talk to her? Make her aware that her family and friends are concerned with the way she's acting. I'm sure if she only knew, she would come to her senses. I wasn't true if that was the case, but I had to try something. He continued, Mr. Richardson, from what I've witnessed, your wife is using her, questionable behavior as a strategy to win this game. While it's not my place to say whether or not I approve of this strategy, she isn't breaking any laws. He had to know I was less than pleased with our discussion thus far and continued. You see, Mr. Richardson, even if I were to speak to your wife, doing so would affect everyone in the house, not just your family. It wouldn't be fair to the others. We also have the integrity of the game to consider. Integrity of the game? You gotta be shitting me, right? You throw my wife into a situation with a predator, and you expect me to think there is any integrity? Listen, Mr. Richardson, it's not what you think. To begin with, Mrs. Richardson applied to be on the show. We didn't seek her. And while Jake is not exactly the boy next door, I assure you we screen our house guest very well. There are plenty of background checks, and they all came up clean on this young man. I was seething as he went on. With that said, we here at WW do not make a habit of allowing sexual predators on the show. I will admit that Jake seems to be enamored with your pretty suburban housewife, and there's no denying there is a certain amount of chemistry between them. What? I screamed into the phone much louder than I thought possible. Being her husband, I realize you don't see it that way, and I would be surprised if you did. But believe me when I say that social media is all abuzz about that storyline. However, nothing they're doing is illegal. Fact is, your wife is a big girl, and could have turned down his advances at any time and chose not to. Believe me, if your wife showed any resistance and he pressed her on it, we would have stepped in immediately and protected her. Problem is, there technically isn't anything to protect her from, at least from our point of view. I was madder than hell, but he did have a point. She certainly made no attempt to put a halt to his advances. Worse yet, was he right when he said that a-hole and my wife did appear to have a chemistry between them? How is that even possible? All of a sudden, it felt like I was punched in the stomach. All along, I was trying to figure out why I had felt so strongly about all of those little touches and hugs. Things that may have seemed so innocuous and innocent to others, yet continued rip my heart out whenever I saw it. My God, that was it all along, wasn't it? I guess I just didn't want to admit to myself, but that was it. There was definitely chemistry between them. My Kathy, the love of my life and the mother of my child, appeared to have chemistry with another man. In a matter of weeks, I went from happily married to being replaced by my wife. What a nightmare. I was quiet for a moment before having an epiphany aloud. This is just about the ratings, isn't it? His smirk covered his entire face when he replied, Bringing in ratings is my job, Mr. Richardson. How did I know he was smirking over the phone? Easy. I could actually hear the maggot smirk from coast to coast. He went on, Don't get me wrong. If any of us thought your wife was in any imminent physical danger, we would have intervened immediately. I can understand your concern, though. Your wife appears to be on the verge of an affair, and you feel helpless to stop it. Perfectly understandable, but again, my job is ratings. That's what I get paid for. I'm not a marriage counselor. I take it your ratings are good then? Never better. My bosses are very pleased, but I will admit that I wish it didn't come at your family's expense. I truly mean that, but please try to see it our way. The entire country is hanging on your wife's every move to see if the cute little suburban housewife will remain loyal to her husband or, well, I don't want to upset you any more than you already are. A little too late for that, don't you think? I'll be honest with you. May I call you James? No. All right then, Mr. Richardson. But I can promise you that we did not plan on this happening with your wife and the other gentleman. Gentleman, huh? He ignored me and continued, I won't lie. This is turning out better than we could have ever imagined here at ITN. Yet we've broadcast hundreds of shows over the course of 15+ seasons with nothing like this ever remotely happening. By this I mean a married house guest seemingly open to an affair. Knowing that she and her spouse were happy and faithful at the beginning only adds to the intrigue. I was quiet. I didn't know what to say. He then added, like I said, you have a nice family and I truly am sorry this is happening to you. Yeah, sounds it. It's true. Please don't misunderstand. When I say we're pleased with the turn of events, it's nothing personal. Again, our job is ratings, and your wife just may be the best thing that ever happened to W. I was just about to hang up and lick my wounds when he said, I'm not sure if anyone contacted you yet, but we'll be sending a camera crew to our house to have a live feed from your living room for an upcoming show. I know you and your daughter will be there, and would like to see all of your family and friends watching the show. We'll show everyone they're cheering Cathy on. You'll see her and she'll see you. Even though there won't be any audio contact between the two of you, she'll still be able to see that her family is safe and sound and backing her every step of the way. Did this guy not listen to any of our conversation? Then I told him it would be a cold day in hell when I allowed his camera crew inside our house. Do I have to remind you that we have a signed contract from Cathy allowing us access into the house? He then asked smugly, her name is on the mortgage. Is it not Mr. Richardson? I grunted that it was and he said, good. You can expect them there sometime in the coming weeks. Is there anything else you need of me before? The conversation ended right there as I hung up. I had never felt so alone and helpless in my life. Here I was married to the most beautiful woman in the world as far as I was concerned, and she was 3,000 miles away being seduced by some smooth-talking a-hole. The worst part was I got to watch it every night. I sat in front of the TV watching her slowly but surely being seduced into the arms of another, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it. Later that night I watched as Jake continued to manipulate Cathy's emotions and seemingly touch her in ways that pushed all her buttons. Then I would see her reactions and that goddamned chemistry they seemed to have. For the first time in my life, I wish that the television had never been invented. Again, that gut feeling came back telling me there was more to come. Much more, and I would have to watch from afar with no hope of it ending unless Cathy wanted it to. I felt so helpless. I had always trusted Cathy with my life, but now I wasn't so sure. I recall watching those previous seasons with her where she would tease me about hooking up with some young hunk if she ever got on the show. She knew it drove me crazy because I was so jealous. She would even suggest that one of the married women on the show should consider flirting or even having a little fling to further her chances of winning the game. I remember saying that the woman would be nuts to put her marriage on the line just to win some silly game and that it wouldn't be worth it. She answered, it could be worth it. Not only that, maybe a little bit thrilling too. When she saw I was really getting angry and said that if it were my wife I would divorce her in a heartbeat, she would giggle and say, I love jerking your chain. You're so cute when you're all jealous. You could never divorce me and you know it. Thing is, even though she would laugh about it, I always felt there was a glint in her eye that said she just might go through with it if ever given the chance. I never pursued it any farther because I figured what are the chances of her ever getting picked to be on the show? So much for that logic. In trying to avoid conflict and starting an argument for no reason I am watching my wife being seduced on national TV. I guess we should have argued at the time, but who would have guessed that she'd ever be selected to be on this freaking show? Despite what many might believe, I am not a complete idiot. Not to say I don't have my moments though. I realized that Zach Blevins had ulterior motives. The ratings must have been going through the roof if the talk heard around our hometown was any indication. I never thought he was going to be overly accommodating, and it turned out I was right. A bit surprised that he wouldn't budge at all and at least talk to Cathy on the side, but for the most part one expected to be stonewalled. Then why bother, you ask? Up until that point I didn't see much else I could do. I didn't really feel any better the next day when I left early again to see a lawyer with the contract Cathy had signed in hand. For now, I'll just say it did not end well. Now before you criticize me too harshly for anything I may or may not have done and scratching your head saying why the hell he didn't do this or that, I offer the following in my defense. Though I said I'm not a complete idiot, I am a simple man. On a really good day, I'm an average guy. What I mean to say I'm average height, maybe average looks, and have an average job. I'm unfamiliar with dealing with television producers, lawyers, or the complexities of contracts. Even I consider myself to be a boring, somewhat dull guy, but at the end of the day, I do consider myself to be both a loving and caring husband and father that would do anything possible to protect his loved ones. Things that I'm not is a former Army Ranger or Navy SEAL. Few of us are, and there's a reason for that. I'm not a former CIA agent or a spy with surveillance gadgets out the wazoo. I'm not trained in martial arts. I have yet to accept my first match in the ultimate fighting ring, and I never had the inclination to sign up for ninja warrior lessons down at the mall. Played a lot of sports, so I'm not totally out of shape, but I'm also not a weightlifter or marathon runner. Now picture yourself as just an average run-of-the-mill family man with no special training of any kind. Your life is perfect in every way. You have a loving and faithful wife, beautiful daughter, good friends, and you mow the lawn once a week in the summer. Perfect, right? Stay with me here. You're just gliding along when one day life sneaks up on you when you least expect it and kicks you in the balls as hard as it can. Then, when falling to the ground in extreme pain holding said balls, life bitch slaps you for good measure. See what I mean yet? Nothing that I have done in past, either physically or mentally, had prepared me for the situation I was now in. Like I said, on a good day, I'm average. What I also am is a very irate, jealous husband, totally lost without any real direction. I couldn't get my hands on the man seducing my wife because he was being protected, but don't doubt for a second that if given the opportunity, one wouldn't beat him within an inch of his life. Then again, I might not be able to stop myself from going all the way and dumping his body somewhere off the beaten path. As for my jealousy, which by the way I don't consider to be over the top, but they're nonetheless, I'll gladly admit comes from my own insecurities. I never thought I would ever find anyone as perfect for me as Kathy, and the thought of ever losing her was just too painful to think about. I may be average and maybe dull, but I do have a pretty good sized temper that I'm trying to control the best I can, if for no other reason than just being there for my daughter. I believe that my daughter, along with Kathy's sister and parents, were on my side and wanted nothing more than to see my wife come to her senses, but I got the feeling that there might be a different thought process with friends, acquaintances, and the rest of the world. Despite Kathy's behavior on the show, it was as if people couldn't get enough of the potential cheating wife and the family that may be torn apart by a woman too caught up in the moment to realize what's going on around her. I had spoken to the lawyer only hours earlier, yet now sat down with a can of ginger ale and bag of chips for another episode of sheer hell. The network show wasn't on until the next night, but I settled in to watch the cable version at 10 o'clock. They called it the live feed, and much of it was live. However, they did show a lot of pre-recorded material that they deemed too hot for the network. Not a surprise that Kathy and lover boy took up a lot of this time. I was in the living room while Sarah was finishing her homework in her room. I was pretty sure she was already done, and just assumed that with the direction the show was going, it would be difficult to be in the same room as me. She might also have been trying to avoid seeing her old man cry, which was a distinct possibility. The show began, and it didn't take long for them to show my darling wife. It began with Jake and Kathy sitting by the pool with some of the others. She looked fantastic in a skimpy white two-piece swimsuit that she must have purchased for the show on the Saturday before she left. To say I was conflicted is an understatement. She looked absolutely gorgeous, and a part of me was bursting with pride knowing that the beautiful 42-year-old blonde housewife that could easily pass to be in her 20s was my wife and lover. Then I wondered if she's still proud that I was her husband. Also, the realization began to set in that though the suit fit her well, it was far too revealing for a faithful housewife to be wearing in the presence of strange men. My heart began to sink at that thought, and it practically exploded when I realized that her intentions were to wear it for Jake. Not me, her husband. God, how I loved this woman. How could she not understand how her actions were tearing my heart out little by little, as I began having thoughts of what I might have to do if she went too far. Difficult decisions may be approaching, and I wasn't any too sure that I could make them in my state of mind. They had now gotten up and walked over to the couch not far from the pool, and the others soon joined them. Kathy had a towel wrapped around her yet was still cold. Jake, being the gentleman he was, pulled her close and put his arm around her to keep her warm. My heart was breaking while my brain was suggesting ways to hurt the a-hole holding her. There is little doubt that he was in full seduction mode. Worse yet, she's fully accepting his advances. Her excuse later would probably be that it was just part of the game and she was just acting. I've known Kathy for a long time, and I can tell you right now she's not that good of an actress. Anyone with half a brain could see that she was enjoying the attention. The other house guests all appear very uncomfortable with their actions. This is especially true for two of the other married women. It's obvious by the disapproving looks that what's taking place is no longer a part of gameplay, and this woman they barely know anything about is risking her marriage for more than just money. The other house guests go in for the night, leaving only Jake and my wife on the couch outside. Jake then begins to smoke and offers Kathy one. My jaw almost hit the floor as she accepted it, and then the light that followed. What the hell was happening? Sure, Kathy had been a light smoker when we first met, but she had quit long before Sarah was born, basically because she knew how much I hated it. I wasn't controlling, mind you, and didn't preach to her, yet she knew I disapproved because it was so unhealthy. Yet here was my loving wife taking a deep drag before blowing out a plume of smoke high into the air. She looked comfortable doing it as well, which made me wonder if she had been smoking recently and was hiding it from me. Then again, maybe she never quit at all and was an expert at concealing it from me. I no longer knew what to think. It also made me wonder why she seemed so comfortable around this younger guy, and if maybe she had been doing something else all along and was good at concealing that as well. Never would have thought of such a thing before that morning the TV people showed up on our front lawn. But now a seed had been planted. As I watched the two of them snuggling, I thought I was going to be physically ill. My heart just sank as Jake looked to see if anyone was around, and seeing that they were in fact alone, raised his arm over his head. As if on cue, she melted into his body as she had done with me so many times while on our own couch watching TV. And like me, Jake then easily slid his arm around her shoulder and drew her closer. I honestly believed at that moment if Jake suggested they both leave the show and crisscross the country robbing banks like some modern-day Bonnie and Clyde, she would have walked out the door with him without giving it a thought. Hell, Harley could drive the getaway car, which would free them up to make out in the backseat in between bank jobs. By now, Harley was becoming a sneaky little piece of shit like his buddy. Even the host, Katie Ross, saw that these two had a bromance going. I only wish they liked each other even more and were gay. But sadly, that wasn't the case, and Jake had eyes only for Kathy. Harley, too, had been casting his eyes her way, and it seemed to me that neither a-hole had a problem working with the other to get what they wanted. Despite what Kathy might think of Jake, the last thing in the world he was going to be was jealous. Just as long as he got her was all he cared about. There was no real emotional connection on his part, and certainly not any love. Jake only loved himself, and I believe the only stipulation he would have with sharing my wife with Harley was that Jake would have her first, and then they would take turns after that. What the hell was happening to my life? The thought of sharing my wife was both ridiculous and disgusting, yet a little over a month into show there was the chance another man might win her and do just that. I hated myself for even having these kinds of thoughts. When the night's show ended, I was wondering if I should even bother watching the cable version. I wasn't sure if I could take any more of what I was seeing. The last thing in the world I wanted to see was my beautiful wife being seduced by another man, but found it impossible to look away because I just had to know what was happening. Now I've heard of husbands that like to watch their wives with other men. Let me make one thing clear. I found nothing erotic with what was taking place and cringed at the thought it would go any farther. Watching the events taking place did increase my blood pressure though. Reason being, I had murder on my mind. Not exactly erotic, is it? Sarah must have been watching upstairs because as soon as the show ended, she appeared in the living room with me with an incredibly sad look on her face. "Dad, I'm scared." "Why's that, pumpkin?" She walked over and sat on the other end of the couch, but didn't lean back. She was upset and nervous, and it showed just by her body language. "It's Mom. She's acting all weird." I hesitated for a moment before giving the well-thought-out answer of, "Yeah, I know. It really is scary how deep I can be at times." My daughter continued, "Since when does Mom smoke?" I mean, she lectured me practically every day since I was 3 about the evils of smoking, and there she is doing it on national TV. What do you think she would say when she comes back and finds that I started smoking? "I'll make it easy for you, sweetheart. I'd slap you silly before your mom ever saw it." She looked at me and giggled a bit when she saw me grinning at her. She knows all too well that I would never raise a hand to her or her mother. Then she turned serious and said in a sad and concerned tone, "What's happened to her, Dad?" I shook my head and replied, "Wish I knew. I think she's just all caught up in the show and wants to win at all costs." Sarah then hesitated before saying, "I don't think that last part's totally right, Dad. I see the way she looks at that guy, and I don't think it has anything to do with the game. I hate to say it, but I think she might be falling for that scumbag." I smiled slightly, mostly out of pride that my little girl had grown up and can think for herself. In addition, she was thinking the exact same thoughts as her old man. I too thought that Kathy was too easily led into this seduction on her own, and that she was actually beginning to have feelings for this guy despite the fact that the game was far from over. Then she said something else that resonated with me. She looked right at me and said, "Dad, we have to do something before it's too late. It's scary enough to think that Mom will do just about anything to win the game, but I think it's more than that. I mean, every episode it gets worse. She lets that. Your mom's a big girl, and we have to trust her to make her own decisions. Aside from that, there's not much we can do." I could see the years in her eyes as she asked, "What if she makes the wrong decision?" I hesitated before answering. "Then she'll have to face the consequences, I guess. Would you divorce her?" I couldn't speak at first, but did manage a slight nod. Then with my voice cracking some, I replied, "I don't know, sweetie. It's possible, I guess, but let's not talk about that right now." She was getting frustrated, and it showed a minute later when she said, "Well, what are we going to do about it?" "There's not much we can do about it, sweetheart." She didn't give me time to explain before blowing up. "Damn it, Dad. Are you just going to sit there and take it? I mean, I hear some people calling you a cuck, and it's getting harder and harder to defend you." She then sniffled and placed her face in her hands so I couldn't see her crying. I didn't have to see her face. Her entire body was vibrating. I simply said, "Come here." in a loving yet somewhat forceful tone. She came over and sat next to me on the couch, and I put my right arm around her and held her tight for nearly a minute before asking, "Is that what you think I am? A cuck?" She began crying all over again before stopping long enough to say, "Maybe. No. Oh, I don't know, Dad. I'm so confused." I nodded, saying, "Yeah, me too." I paused for a few more seconds before telling her, "Look, Sarah, I was debating telling you about this, but I guess you painted me into a corner." Well, that and the fact that what little pride I have does tend to get a bit bruised when I hear that people are calling me a cuck, especially my own daughter. I could see the sadness in her eyes as she realized how deep her remarks about me being a cuck had cut me. "Still," she carried on, "what is it, Dad? You can tell me." I looked at her and brushed away her tear with my left hand and said, "You remember me being home late yesterday and today?" She nodded. "Well, yesterday I called the executive producer of the show, some guy named Blevins. He's a little weasel if you want to know the truth. Then I remembered I was talking to my daughter and apologized. She giggled and said that it was all right and that it was nice to see me showing some emotion. Well, you would have loved the call then. Anyway, I explained the situation to him and my fears Mom was going too far for just some game. It was then he explained that your mother had signed a binding contract to have all ties to the outside world severed until the time she was either voted out, makes it to the final night as a competitor, or is voted out and sent to that other house where the losers go before going back on the final night to cast some vote. Pier House. What? Sarah rolled her eyes. It's called Pier House. That's where they'll send Mom if she's one of the last 8 voted out. Yeah, whatever. Anyway, he said it wouldn't be fair to the other house guests if your mother was given special privileges. He told me that any direct contact would mean that the house guest would immediately be sent home. But Dad, doesn't he know this is an emergency? He says it's not. He says if he deems it necessary, he can maybe call your mother off to the side and tell her of my fears, but it would be his call and that he is nowhere near ready to make that call. Why not? Dad, that other guy is seducing Mom and could possibly cause a divorce. You said so yourself. I realize that, but this is a good example of how the world works and why most of the time it's about money. Money? I don't follow. This producer's a slimeball, honey, no question, and to him, it's all about the ratings. He admitted that everyone watching is on the edge of their seat, wondering if the faithful wife and mother is going to fall from grace or come to her senses before she goes too far. I believe it would be called ratings gold. So Mom was set up? It's nothing like that, Pumpkin. He admitted that he couldn't have asked for a better scenario that they have and had always hoped that a season would play out like this one is. Yet I believe him when he says that the people on the show aren't told how to act and that their actions aren't scripted. I paused before continuing. So we're back to your mom being a big girl and hoping she makes the right decisions. Maybe he was lying about the contract being binding, Dad. Ever think of that? Yep. That's why I talked to a friend of mine at work yesterday. His brother's a corporate lawyer, and he said as a favor, he would look over the copy of the contract your mother signed and tell me whether or not it's binding. That's where I went this afternoon. Is it? Binding, that is. I'm afraid so. Those network folks know their stuff. We really are at the mercy of the producers when it comes to contacting your mother, and they're not going to be in any hurry to do that. So we're screwed. She scoffed and replied, "Let's just hope that Mom doesn't get screwed next." She then turned red when she realized what she said, but I only held her tighter and told her I understood her frustration. I also told her I agreed with her assessment of the situation. I could almost see the wheels turning in her head before she called out, "Well, then let's take matters into our own hands." How's that? Let's go get her. We'll sneak in and kidnap her, or better yet, bust through the front gate and force them to hand her over. Watch a lot of TV, do ya? She folded her arms and frowned. Listen, sweetie, I know your heart's in the right place, but we have to look at this logically. Don't get me wrong. I would love nothing more than to go all Rambo on their butts, but it's not realistic. At least the Rambo reference made her smile. Look, Sarah, the studio lot and sound stages are secure, and that Pier House thing where they go if they get voted out is not only secure, but in a secret location. Even if I did get in, I would most certainly get caught long before locating your mother. I would only wind up in jail. I wouldn't mind going to jail if I knew it would stop your mother from doing something she shouldn't be doing, or if I could protect her from these morons. But that's not the case. No matter how hard I try, I will never be able to get close enough to save her from herself. She sniffled as she closed her eyes in angst. I knew the feeling. Besides, if I tried to stop her by doing something stupid and causing her to be kicked off the show, she would hate me even more than she does now. She doesn't hate you, Dad. She still loves you. She sure has a funny way of showing it, Pumpkin. Sarah realized that with the way her mother was acting, any attempt to assure me that she still loved me was going to be a tough sell. I continued, "At this point, about the only thing we can do is hope that your mother gets her head on straight and does the right thing on her own." She looked up at me and with a sad smile said, "Nothing personal, Dad, but I was hoping for a lot better idea than that. Mom looks like she lost her mind or something." I returned her sad smile with one of my own while I held her tighter still. "I know, kiddo. I know." She hesitated for a moment before muttering under her breath, "When did she get so stupid?" Normally, I would have scolded her for talking about her mom that way, but since I was asking myself the same obvious question, I just let it slide. After all, when you're right, you're right. I pondered if I should tell her the one disturbing option the lawyer said. We have then decided that she had every right to know. Again, she saw me lost in my own thoughts and asked, "What is it, Dad?" "Well, do you remember how you asked me a little while ago about if I would ever consider divorcing your mother?" She sniffled while nodding. "Now you have to know if it were to happen, it would be the last resort. I mean, there may come a point when I can no longer." I stopped. She softly said, "I know," as she realized I was having difficulty finishing my last sentence. I took a deep breath and continued, "Well, the lawyer said the only legal recourse we have is if I file for divorce. You see, since your mom signed the contract, there's nothing we can do or no one we can go after. But if I file for divorce, things change." "Like what things?" "By filing for divorce, aside from the obvious result within our family, I will then have the options of suing Jake as well as the network for alienation of affection for their part in causing the breakup of our marriage." "Oh, Dad, no. I'm not ready for divorce just yet, but your mother may be reaching the point of no return when it comes making the decision for me." "I understand, Dad. It's just so sad. I'm sorry about all this, Pumpkin. And don't forget that she's still your mom. Don't let what she's doing to me affect your relationship with her." "Nice try, Father, but don't you think I deserve to be angry as well?" I smiled at my daughter and asked, "Father? Huh? Since when did we get so formal?" She smiled back and shrugged. I was proud of her while sad for her as well. Almost worn out, I found enough energy to say, "It's been a long day. Let's try to get some rest." A few days later, I was sitting on our front porch enjoying a cold one after work when one of my neighbors walked by and gave me the uncomfortable wave of someone who wasn't quite sure if that's what he wanted to do but had choice since our eyes met. That brief gesture got me to thinking. It wasn't to last long, but for a few moments, it washed away the mental images of that a-hole seducing my wife. It was then my mind turned to the varying attitudes of our family, friends, and neighbors. At first, everyone was stunned. Hard not be if you knew my wife. Again, she did some mild flirting in the past and nothing more to my knowledge, although since all of this world's watching stuff started, I wasn't quite as sure. Anyway, like I was saying, everyone was stunned and also felt very sorry for me. I wasn't exactly fond of everyone feeling pity for me, but at least I knew they cared. It also validated my suspicions that there was a lot more going on than I wanted to believe, and that those around me knew I wasn't just some overjealous ogre. They couldn't understand why Kathy was doing what she was doing either, and that boosted my spirits, if only slightly. Though slowly, attitudes began to change again. At first it was mostly the men, but soon many of the women also began to talk under amongst themselves, and I got the impression they believed I was weak for allowing this to go on. I think they felt I should do something about it, instead of just sitting around waiting for my wife to come home. I even overheard some conversations when they thought I couldn't hear saying they would never put up with such actions, and they would have done something about it by now. Of course, they never mentioned what that something might be. Maybe that was the reason that Sarah began having the same feelings, though I never asked her. Sarah didn't want to think that I was a cuck. That much was clear, and she only alluded to it that one time. But I think my explanation convinced her that I truly was between a rock and a hard place. Although I never asked her to, Sarah began to tell others about my meeting with a lawyer and the helplessness I felt in being in a position of watching my wife being seduced from afar without any recourse but to hope my wife comes to her senses. At first, a lot of the men probably thought they would handle things a lot differently and confront the guy by crashing the party. I'm sure when they gave it more thought, they realized that there wasn't much they would be able to do either. Getting past the guard at the studio would be hard enough, but then I would have to find the soundstage where they tape and get in there before being able to confront my good buddy Jake. I would certainly be arrested long before Jake was beaten to a pulp. Being the angry husband that I was, there's not a doubt in my mind that my good buddy would require extensive medical attention if I were to ever get my hands on him. And before you think I'm just trying to be macho, I firmly believe it's in anyone's best interest to avoid any jealous or protective husband. Rule of thumb: never prod the sleeping bear. It usually doesn't end well for the prodder. In the end, most folks realized I was far from accepting of my wife's behavior, but that my options were extremely limited. Though at the time of that uncomfortable wave from my neighbor, some felt that anything short of crashing through the studio's front gate with a machine gun in one hand and a knife clenched in my teeth was a sign I condoned Cathy's actions. Another one of my neighbors was approaching while walking their dog. Instead of putting someone else in the awkward position of having to wave to me, I stood up in my beer and I went inside the house. The following week was more of the same on the show. Jake was taking his time with my wife, and while this was going on, both he and Harley had a stranglehold on the house. Apparently, they were capable in all forms of treachery. Anyway, as promised by Zach Blevins, the show's producer had someone call the house and say that they were sending over a crew of 2 for Thursday's show. It wasn't going to be a big production, but they did have to set up lights for the one camera they were planning on using. I told Sarah about the network broadcasting live from our living room, and not surprisingly, she was upset. Her opinion mirrored mine in that if we just sat there with smiling faces and acted if nothing was happening, her mom would just assume that we were on board with her win at all costs mentality. I had an idea for making Cathy see the light before it was too late, and Sarah loved it. It was probably our last and only chance. 2 network guys arrived and set up their cameras about an hour before, just like they said they would, and I could see they were disappointed to see only Sarah and myself were the only ones there. They asked who else was coming, and were even more disappointed to hear that everyone else was busy with their own lives and couldn't attend. Both guys were friendly enough, and didn't appear to have the attitude that the other Hollywood people I spoke with had. We were then told that we would be going live from our living room directly after the first break. We wouldn't have long to wait. As they neared the first break, Katie Ross, the host, called the house guests into their living room where she was going to tell them that one lucky player was going to see their family and friends. I looked over to Sarah and asked, "You hungry?" She looked back and said, "Yeah, I could eat. What are you thinking?" "Pizza." She stood up and replied, "Sounds good. Let's go." I took out my keys and started following her to the front door when a voice behind me called out, "Excuse me, Mr. Richardson, but you can't leave now. You're about to go live coast to coast." I chuckled. "Actually, I'm about to go to get a pizza. You guys want anything?" "No, it's not that. Come on, Mr. C. Blevins will kill us if you're not here." "Sorry, guys. Nothing personal, but I just can't do this. If Blevins tries to blame you, I'll tell him you had absolutely nothing to do with." "Okay." He nodded and said, "Mr. C? We've been following the show and just want you to know. Well, we're sorry. Don't know what else to say except we'll watch your place till you get back." I just smiled and nodded as I turned to catch up with Sarah. We were just walking into Pizza Hut when my cell phone rang, and I knew who it was even before looking. Both Sarah and I stopped in the parking lot as I answered in an over-exuberant tone that did not match my mood. Mr. Blevins. Good of you to call. How's the weather out there in California? Very funny, Richardson. Where are you? My crew tells me you up and left to go eat pizza just as we were about to go live. Now what's this all about? What's what all about? Pizza? Well, it's Italian in origin that started long before my time. I know what the hell pizza is. I'm talking about leaving before going live. Oh yeah, that. I guess my daughter and I were feeling a bit shy tonight. Shy my butt. Now look, get your butt back to your... I don't know if anyone ever told you this or not, but you say but a lot. Listen, Richardson. That's Mr. Richardson to you. He paused for a moment, swallowing just a smidgen of pride before continuing. Please, Mr. Richardson, listen to reason. If you go home right now, we can still get your family on air together for the first time, since that first show when we taped you on your front lawn. We already explained it the first time as having technical difficulties, but we really need to have you and your family appear. The more the merrier, remember? Oh yeah, I remember, but I'm afraid we can't make it tonight. Maybe we could try this again some other night. But then I can't promise I won't get a Hank Aaron, 4 tacos, or a cheeseburger. Blevins was getting exasperated, which was fine by me. Time to play hardball, Mr. Richardson. If you do not return home this instant, we will take legal action for breach of contract. Have you forgotten that your wife signed a contract to not only appear on our show, but to also allow us to broadcast live from your home when given 24 hours notice? So what's the problem? Cathy's on your show, and your camera crew was allowed access as per the contract. Perhaps you've forgotten, or was maybe never made aware that I never signed a contract with anyone involved with your network, nor has Sarah or anyone else in our family. We do have a dog. Would you like me to ask him if he'd be willing to come on some night? He's with my mother-in-law tonight, but it doesn't hurt to ask him. He might not like short notice though, because he'll need time to see the groomer first. There was silence for a moment before he replied, Your wife was crushed when she expected to see her loving family and instead saw they abandoned her. Is that what you want? I quite honestly don't care what you tell her. Tell me, did all of her housemates go to comfort her, or just one or possibly two. Silence from the West Coast. Look at it this way, Mr. Blevins. At least my wife didn't have to sit watching her replacement's arms are wrapped around me like I had to watch my replacement's arms wrapped around her. Now you're obviously watching the show. So tell me the truth before we go any further. Did a-hole have his arm around her right from the beginning, and did she appear to not only allow it, but looked comfortable doing so? Zach Blevins hesitated at first before asking, I'm not sure I know what you're getting at, Mr. Richardson. Let me make it as simple as possible. Did they look like a couple? Did they look like a damn couple with chemistry? Did they? After quite a few moments of dead air and an audible sigh, he simply said, Good night, Mr. Richardson. I was angry when I hung up, but I was still more confused and heartbroken. As Sarah and I continued walking towards the restaurant, she said, You were really enjoying jerking that guy's chain for a while there, weren't you? I flashed a sad smile and answered, As much as I can enjoy anything anymore, sweetheart. So, on to more important things. What should we get on our pizza? That moment of enjoyment was far too brief, but at least it was something. Like I said earlier, Sarah recorded the show that night, and even though I already knew what to expect, it still ripped my heart out of my chest when I saw it with my own two eyes. Since Sarah and I were already on the road to Pizza Hut when the show started, this is what we missed. The host welcomed World back from the latest commercial break amongst loud cheering from the studio audience just outside the house where Kathy sat. Katie Ross asked Kathy if she would like to have a live look at her family and friends watching the show from the privacy of her own living room back home. Kathy appeared ecstatic and had tears of joy running down her cheeks, but that was about to change. Oh? The tears would still be there, but the joy was about to disappear. Part of me felt terrible. Despite everything that happened to that point, I still loved her, and my first response was to still protect her. But having witnessed what I did seemed to justify my actions to leave the house. At least I felt justified. Kathy did seem genuinely excited to have the chance to look in on us, yet appeared to be very relaxed, too relaxed while leaning against another man with his arms draped around her. It was that chemistry thing again, and I could actually feel a tightness in my chest. You got that? My loving wife had what I assumed to be real tears falling from her eyes, anxiously awaiting the chance to see her family for the first time in ages, and all the while she's cuddling with another man. If I could have gotten my hands on Loverboy, I would have killed him with my bare hands. This certainly wasn't any part of gameplay, and the more I thought about it, nothing she was doing anymore was about gameplay. Katie Ross, the host, looked very uncomfortable with what was taking place, as did most of the players. Jake, however, had this smirk that could only mean one thing. Though he'd never met me, he was laying claim to my wife while rubbing my nose in it, knowing there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. He was being fueled by Kathy's comments about me, alluding to the fact that I was weak and didn't care. The only other person in the room that seemed to approve was the farm boy Harley. He looked like a big kid standing in front of the line for the roller coaster, knowing after Jake finally succeeded seducing my wife, he would have the next ride. Anyway, I watched in horror as Kathy was sitting in his arms with her hand on his chest and gently stroking it as if they were on a date at the movies. Speaking of movies, it was showtime. When the cameras came on in our home, Kathy was left staring blankly at an empty couch and equally vacant room. Katie, the host, immediately tried to cover by saying, I think we're experiencing technical difficulties. Why don't we take a break and we'll be right back? Kathy was very upset when they showed the live shot of our living room, and lo and behold, she began crying a river. I wasn't sure why, because I doubted if she even remembered who Sarah and I were. If she did remember, it might be the first time since she left our house. Where did she seek refuge from the pain? She turned her head and buried it in Jake's chest, just as she once did with me during a scary movie or a lightning storm. He immediately began offering words of comfort like, You deserve better, and we'll talk about this later. I was seething. Now, if you think that my actions may have driven her into his arms, just remember that she was already there when the cameras came on. Nobody drove her anywhere. And though the cameras were on, there wasn't any way I could tell her I love her and beg her to come home. Besides, if you recall, I pleaded with her not to go before this all started, and look how well that worked out. If she was willing to have me see her for the first time in over 6 weeks, while in the arms of another man, she obviously loved me no more than she loved our couch. Then again, maybe that's why she was crying. She saw the couch and realized how much she missed the couch. I also wasn't sure what was worse, her being oblivious to the fact that she was tearing apart the family all on her own, or that she was aware of what she was doing and of the probable consequences, yet willing to live out her fantasy regardless. No matter what the reason or cause, she had serious issues and chose to ignore the obvious, that our marriage was on life support and my hand was on the plug. As Sunday's network broadcast started, I began to question my own sanity for sitting through the humiliation that my loving wife was heaping on me on a daily basis. Cathy's actions were making me physically ill, and worse yet, she was slowly chipping away at my heart with every tick of the clock. It mattered not if I was watching or not at this point, because now that I had those images in my head, that's all I could think of at work, driving, eating, and sleeping. Friends and family stopped discussing the show with us, and my guess was they figured it was a sore subject. Our friends and family figured right, but Cathy and world's watching was still the #1 topics between Sarah and me. We searched for answers and leaned on one another for support. If it weren't for Sarah, I'd be in much worse condition than I was. That's saying a lot since I was a mess. We were both in the living room as the next show started. However, watching it together was getting difficult as well as embarrassing. By now we were in week 7, and during this time people connived, backstabbed, and voted each other out. The game went on, but as in previous seasons when I watched with my wife, I didn't really care about any of the people. Well, with the exception of 3 this season. Also, 8 people had been voted off of the show, which meant that anyone voted out going forward did not go home but rather went to the Pier House. Here they would remain until the final show, where those 6 people would return to cast a vote for one of the final 2 survivors to decide a winner. Cathy was ecstatic to make it this far, though I was less than happy about it. Far less than happy about it. In fact, I was more convinced that her exuberance came from the fact that she got to spend more time living out some kind of deep-seated fantasy with her boy toy than it did competing in the game. Couldn't she see what she was doing? Fan or no fan of the show, she had crossed the line long ago with what could be considered acceptable behavior from a faithful wife. Though I couldn't for the life of me figure out what was wrong with her, I did manage to eliminate one possible cause. It wasn't sheer stupidity, because nobody, and I mean nobody, could be that stupid. Jake won the competition that week and the right to be house leader, which earned him the right to have his own room. Lovely. My fears reached a new level as hope seemingly abandoned me completely. Believe it or not, things got worse. Everything was all right until the end of that night's show. It was then the nosedive occurred while everyone was sitting out back. Jake stood up, and I could see the arrogant prick was up to no good. He stretched and then said he was tired and going to take a shower, and looked over to my wife and raised an eyebrow and winked. A moment later, Cathy agreed that a shower was a good idea, and she started to follow him inside. The other house guests were aghast. The a-hole stopped and let her catch up so they could walk in the house together with their arms around each other. There it was again, that freaking chemistry. Hell, though it was breaking my heart, even I thought of them as a couple at this point. It was impossible not to. Once they shut the door behind them, the others began talking about them instantly, and the network surprisingly decided not to bleep out the words 304 and cougar, but did so for an adjective or 2 spoken before them. Katie Ross appeared on camera to bring the show to a close and seemed upset by what had just taken place. I believe she was trying to remain nonpartisan, yet I thought I could hear more than a hint of disapproval in her voice. Sarah and I were both on edge as we watched the show, mostly in silence. It was as if we were both waiting for acts to fall, but if we didn't talk about it, that it wouldn't happen. Nice thought, even if it didn't work that way. So that's how the network episode ended when I switched over to the cable feed. My emotions were all over the place, and I wasn't sure I was prepared to see what might happen next, but I couldn't resist. Like the rest of the show to that point, I didn't want to watch, but just had to know what was going on. Sarah was already sniffling. I had a real bad feeling going into that night's cable show, and apparently Sarah did as well, because after the opening of show she got up and kissed me on the cheek and said, "I'm feeling kinda tired, Dad. I'm going to bed." In reality, I knew she was going to watch it upstairs on her room. I didn't want her to, but she was a big girl now and had the right to watch if she chose to. It was easy to see that she had the same fears I had of something happening tonight that a father and daughter ought never to watch together. The knot in my stomach was reaching epic proportions, and I was feeling queasy, just knowing that there was no stopping what was taking place, and that there were thousands of miles between us. The cable show was just about to begin when I noticed I had trouble seeing the TV. I was glad Sarah had gone upstairs because my tears had already started. As I mentioned before, what a nightmare. Cathy sat down on one of the chairs in the shower room, still wearing the same skimpy white bikini she wore on a previous show. Jake had his trunks and a t-shirt on, but when he took the shirt off, I thought that Cathy's eyes were going to fall out of their sockets. Wasn't sure why, because she saw him shirtless before, but maybe because they were all alone this time. I don't know. Jake then steps into the shower and starts running the water, and then disappears behind the partial shower door that allows the audience at home to see him from the knees down and the chest or neck up, depending on how tall someone is. He then looks over to my wife and asks, "Care to join me?" She then asks, "What do you think my husband would say if I got onto the shower with a single young hunk like you?" I I would like to say that my wife was coming to her senses by asking that question. However, the tone of her voice seemed more about foreplay, flirting, and turning on a-hole than it was a serious question as to how I would truly feel. If she didn't already know by now how I felt, by now she really was dense, though I was beginning to think that her being evil and cruel was a distinct possibility as well. Even though she mentioned her husband, she left little doubt that I was the last thing on her mind at that moment. I have no idea how that is even possible, yet I witnessed it myself. Lover boy just smirked as she walked towards him. I began shaking my head, softly pleading aloud, "Oh my God, don't do it, baby. Please don't do this to me. We can still get past this if you stop now." Despite all that's been happening, I was still shocked to see Kathy accept Jake's invitation to share a shower. And a moment later, she stepped inside and closed the door. Almost immediately, Jake took off his trunks and hung them over the door and pulled Kathy close, suggesting she take off her bikini. At first, she says no out of concern that someone might see them in the shower together. My thoughts to this was that the other 6 people were still out back, so Kathy wouldn't have to worry about them. Sure, her daughter and husband would see, as well as the rest of the US and anyone in the world with a satellite, but aside from that, there was no reason for her to be embarrassed. It was also disturbing that this was her only fear at the time. Kathy pulled away, but only to do what I considered to be the unthinkable. She took off her top and hung it over the door next to a-hole's trunks. She didn't even pause to give her next action a second thought, as the next thing I knew, I was looking at her legs with her bikini bottoms wrapped around her ankles. Tears began to roll down my face as he pulled her in close once more, only now they were both completely naked. I had it. It was over. My marriage was over, and I never imagined that it would end in this manner. I couldn't see what he was doing, but he must have tried something, because Kathy said, "No, not here. Someone could walk in on us. How about we finish up and go up to my room?" She looked into his eyes and smiled sweetly, like she did with me a million times over the years, and softly said, "Okay, but just hold me for a few minutes." They then got out of the shower and went up to Jake's house leader room. He gets under the covers and grins at my wife and asks if she's cold. She smiles sweetly, a smile that was once reserved for me alone, and softly replied in a cute, almost childlike voice, "A little." He pulls back the covers, and just like that, for the first time since we've been married, Kathy shares a bed with someone other than me. It occurred to me that the cameras and microphones remained focused on my wife and lover boy, almost to the point where they had their own show. I guess you think of the dumbest things when under stress. At first, it was just cuddling and pillow talk with Kathy telling Jake all about her, yours truly. Unfortunately, a-hole was guiding the conversation in the direction that worked best for him. Not surprisingly, she didn't dwell on the fact that I worked my butt off to give my family the best life that I possibly could, and that I coached youth baseball and hockey in what little spare time I had, and did practically whatever she wanted me to with a smile. Instead, she said that I wasn't always there for her emotionally. What does that even mean? We've always talked about things we did that day, or how we feel about any topic either of us brings up. Was I supposed to get a degree in psychiatry to better tend to her emotional needs? Where was this coming from, and did they at some point replace my wife with this imposter? Then she said that I'm not as intimate with her as she would like. I've tried any number of times to keep the fires burning, only to be told that she's too tired, or that she wasn't feeling up to it that night. In fact, going back to before the show started, it had been months since we were intimate. Again, not that I hadn't tried. Now I'm no young stud. I would like to say that I'm no longer a young stud, but the fact is I never was. I've always been average. Still, she never complained. Until now, and I was receiving all of the blame. You might be thinking to yourself, well, if you weren't a stud, maybe that's the problem. But even being an average guy with extremely limited sexual prowess, did I really deserve any of this? She went on to say she wished that I spent as much time with her as he did. Gee, I wonder why that is. How could he spend so much time with her and I can't? Perhaps it's because they're locked in the goddamn house together with nothing else to do except make a game out of trying to get in my wife's panties. Not to mention Loverboy doesn't have to mow the lawn or shovel snow in the winter. He doesn't have to go to parent/teacher conferences or fix things around the house. And there's one other thing I'm missing but can't quite place what it is. Oh yeah, I have to go to work for 8 or more hours a day to support my family. Guess that didn't count for much in my wife's eyes. Even harder for me to swallow was the fact that if she could betray me so easily, perhaps I never counted much in my wife's eyes. They were both talking in hushed tones, and I began feeling sick to my stomach again, thinking that this closeness was normally reserved for just Kathy and me. But I began realizing that a lot of those things that were reserved for the two of us were falling by the wayside. It was in those hushed tones I mentioned when my world began to completely fall apart. Jake asked, "You don't seem happy with your husband, are you?" She giggled slightly and hesitated, and I wanted to believe she was going to be too embarrassed to answer the question, even though by now I had a pretty good idea what answer probably was if she answered honestly. Instead, she softly replied, "Yes, for the most part." I noticed she hesitated again, like she was holding back on elaborating. It had to have been obvious because even a-hole noticed it. "What were you going to say?" he asked in a concerned voice that certainly did not match the level of concern he really had for her, that arrogant prick. She began to blush and replied, "Look, I don't feel comfortable talking like this. What if James or my daughter sees this?" Guess she thought the shower was only for the benefit of the old saying that cleanliness is close to godliness. Maybe she thought that taking a shower with him equated into a religious experience and that I would accept it graciously. Speaking for myself, I know I kept repeating God's name while I watched. Of course I added some things to it like, "God no, God please stop," and the ever-popular, "God damn you." Loverboy's smirk somehow grew wider as he replied, "How can they see this? How can anybody see this? We're locked up here in the house leader's room, my room, safe from the rest of the house, and believe me, they don't suspect a thing." She giggled nervously and answered, "What about TV, dummy?" "Aw, their first fight, I thought. Maybe they could figure a way to make up. I'm sure my buddy Jake would think of something." He acted hurt, and she giggled again. If it weren't for the situation, her giggle would have been cute. "You're safe, Kathy. They never air any of this stuff. They can't. Kids are watching. So we can talk about whatever we want to." He paused for a moment and, raising an eyebrow and flashing an evil grin, said, "We can also do whatever we want to, and no one will be the wiser." "Are you sure about that?" "Of course I'm sure. You said you've seen every episode of the show, right?" "Yeah," she answered, but it was drawn out and sounded more like it was a half question, as if she wasn't quite sure she believed him. "Do you really think this is the first time a situation like this had come up? I mean, where a married woman got romantically involved with another man? A man that loves her more than her husband? Are you saying you love me? What do you think?" She smiled and blushed. He didn't even say he loved her. It would have been a lie if he did say he loved her, but he didn't and probably couldn't because the prick never loved anyone in his life. He was only using her, playing with her emotions to get what he wanted, though she couldn't see it. Yet by the expression on her face, it was clear that she thought she'd heard it. She only heard what she wanted to hear, and in her mind, she heard him say he loved her. She was lost in the moment and lost in her fantasy. I wanted to jump through the TV screen and shake some sense into her. This guy was awfully smooth, though he was still a piece of shit. Jake was making the most of his time having Kathy trapped with him, and was making the most of his time having me trapped with him as well. I was trapped because he knew I'd be watching as he slowly seduced my wife, and gave him the perfect opportunity to rub my nose in it. Using my total helplessness to his advantage, he asked her in a loving and caring tone, "Is he any good in bed? I mean, does he really do it for you?" The prick really was a romantic devil, wasn't he? She didn't answer right away, though finally did with, "Well, he thinks he's good in bed and tries real hard." She paused a moment before continuing, "Don't get me wrong. He's very sweet and means well. It's just that most of the time he's inadequate." I just sat staring at the TV, my emotions all over the place, though I didn't have time to let it all sink in before they continued their assault on my very soul. Moments later, I saw movement from under the covers and knew from the direction of the movement that Kathy's hand was somewhere it shouldn't have been. I could sense that something was starting to happen that sure as hell shouldn't be happening with a wife with someone other than her husband. Jake removed any doubt as to what was taking place when he asked her if he's bigger than me. She giggled and said, "Oh yeah, it's not even close. I never measured it or anything, but I'm pretty sure he's below average in that department." Then grinned widely while adding, "But you're not below average, that is?" My newly found inferiority issues were giving my anger a run for its money. They continued in hushed tones, but the microphones picked it up as clearly as if she was yelling it from a mountaintop. Did she hate me? I wondered. My anger was immense at this point, and was only rivaled by the deep sadness tearing my heart apart. Jake then tells her something in her ear, and Kathy smiled and flashed an evil grin, then ducked under the covers. The position and movement of her head left no doubt, even to a naive, broken-hearted, inadequate fool like me, what was going on. Again, I began to breathlessly plead to an empty room, "Please, God, make it stop." A moment later, Jake's face began to morph, and a look of ecstasy replaced that arrogant smirk. The deed was done, and for all of world to bear witness to, my lovely wife appeared from under the covers. To add salt into my already gaping wound, the service she had just performed for her boy toy was something she never did for me because she always said it was disgusting. Not that that was on my mind at the moment, but I think it's worth mentioning now. Even with the betrayal on Kathy's part, one couldn't help feeling a little bad for her. Oh, there was a part of me that wanted to strangle her too, but I couldn't help thinking what everyone was going to think about her afterwards and the things she's going to have to put up with for the rest of her life. People whispering behind her back and having to face family and friends, most of whom are old-fashioned conservatives like myself. As I've said before, the worst part for me was I could do nothing but watch as my biggest reason for living cruelly betrayed me. She didn't know it yet, but our marriage was no longer slipping away. It was over. Even though I didn't necessarily want it to, life went on and the sun rose on a brand new day. I had cried myself to sleep the night before. I mean, what little sleep there was. However, by lunch my decisions were already made. The decisions themselves were fairly easy to make due to Kathy's actions. The hard part was going to be living with and accepting those decisions. I never expected anything like this to happen to my marriage, so I was like a ship foundering in a storm on the ocean. I was totally lost and had no idea where to turn. I was going to need a lot of help and lean on those willing assist. One thing I had to do was get away before Kathy came home. There was time, of course, because even if she was voted out of the house, she still would have to stay until the final show in that Pier House thing or whatever it's called, and that last show was nearly a month away. I had to get away. I couldn't face her and certainly didn't want to talk to her ever again. I was bound to do anything in my power to distance myself from all of this. Yet there was more to it than just getting away from Kathy. Because of her, I wanted to. No, wait. I needed to get away from almost anything and everything associated with my soon-to-be former life. My daughter Sarah was the lone exception to my wanting to leave everything behind. Yet, in an ironic twist, we were to be separated nonetheless. Regardless of the miles between us, my intention was to speak to her as often as she's let me. My first conversation was with Sarah. I told her I might be leaving soon, and if she wouldn't mind staying at her friend Debbie's house if her parents wouldn't mind, so they could report to school in Maine together in a few weeks. I then talked to my boss and asked for and received a transfer to our office in DeLand, Florida. This was just one of many things I needed help with, and fortunately my boss stepped to the plate and not only set up the transfer but also set me up with a place to stay. He never said as much, but it was obvious he had watched the show, probably with his wife, and that his willingness to assist me in every way possible came from putting himself in my place. I really couldn't thank him enough and told him so. Then I talked to the lawyer to discuss many other details. He wound up being a pretty good guy. I know, I was surprised too. We talked about the divorce and he was shocked to hear that aside from a few $1,000s to get started again, I was walking away from our marriage with nothing. I just wanted out, and giving up the house, her car, and all of our savings worth a few $100s was well worth it to me. Everything was paid off so she and her new boy toy would be set for life, and she should be able to live happily ever after to complete her fantasy life. You may ask, why not try to break her like she broke me? Well, it's as simple as this. I still loved her and always will. That's what hurt the most, I think. Loving someone as much as I did while despising her nearly as much, if not more. I'm also more than aware that my approach for the divorce was the worst choice I could make. But if it meant her not contesting it and never having to see her face to face again, it was money well spent in my book. My offer obviously fell short in her eyes, but not because of the finances, but I'm getting ahead of myself again. We'll catch up with point a bit later. It was time to play hardball with the network, and my first pitch was going to be directly at Zach Blevins' head. Why go for a brushback pitch when a beanball would be much more effective? I told my lawyer my idea, and when he was finished laughing, he said it just might work, though he was the first to admit that the entertainment industry was a totally different breed. I assured him he was my guy and wanted him to handle any possible settlement. But a lawsuit, a highly publicized lawsuit, would be a last resort. It was time to try and make a deal with the producer of the show. Something that will make both the network and Sarah and I happy. My idea was far from a sure thing, but it was certainly worth a shot. One drawback was that Blevins might still be upset at Sarah and me for vacating our living room in the presence of the cameras not long ago. If he held a grudge, he just might tell me to take my deal and shove it up my butt. Believe me when I say I wanted to nail them as hard as I possibly could, though I knew my best chance was to remain realistic. Any threat of a lawsuit would probably remain just that, a threat. They had too much firepower for a guy like me to go up against, and even if I did have a good case, they would be able to tie it up in the courts for the next 50 years, not to mention that the legal cost would be astronomical. So my legal team, my team of one, advised me to ask for a reasonable amount and said they would probably not be held responsible. Basically, I was going to take what I could get. My lawyer said that Blevins, the same producer that aired my wife's descent on the national stage and AITA network, actually agreed in principle to my proposal within an hour. One of the things that put us over the top was when my lawyer mentioned that I could always go on the talk show circuit to basically badmouth the top-rated show in the world. They actually feared that I would go through with what I thought was a fairly innocuous threat. Hey, whatever works, right? But what really caught their attention was my idea that would send their precious ratings through the roof. My lawyer said that when Blevins heard my outline, he practically had an orgasm. We had to have a couple of contingency plans in case the game went in a different direction than we would have liked, though in the end we wound up using plan A. It's the only goddamn thing that had gone right since this whole thing began. Oh, and the network did agree to bribe me. I mean, reward me $800,000 and pay for my daughter's college education just as long as I don't bring an individual lawsuit or name Blevins or the network in any future suit. Let's face it, it was still probably a drop in the bucket for the network, though I did find it sadly ironic that Kathy went on the show to win $500,000, and I'm the one that received a check that was $300,000 over and above that amount. Don't get me wrong, the money doesn't make up for my lost marriage and being totally humiliated in front of an entire nation, not by a long shot, but it was better than nothing and would make it easier to get settled in Florida and into my lonely new life. All things considered, my ultimate wish would be to go back in time and return my old life. I had a lot to do that kept me busy, but I still hurt like hell. The network show wasn't on the next night, so not as many people were going to see the upcoming carnage. Unfortunately, our family and friends, as well as most of hometown, were going to be watching. Sarah would be watching up in her room under the guise of being too tired to watch it with me. There was nothing I could do to stop her, really. Like I said earlier, she was 18 and old enough to understand what was going on. Despite this, we seemed to have an unwritten and unspoken rule not to watch the cable version together any longer. Though the network show could get uncomfortable to watch together, the cable version was as close to a spicy video as you could get without any actual nudity. They do blur out the nudity, though it seems that Kathy's best work was under the covers. Nothing special happened until a half hour into the show when Kathy was out on the outdoor couch, smoking with her boy toy and Harley, the other a-hole. Was this the same woman I married? Jake then whispers to my wife to join him in bed. She blushes and flashes a sexy smile, and every misstep she makes tears me apart inside. He then stands up and offers his hand to assist my wife to her feet like the gentleman he'll never be. Still holding her by the hand, he led her into the kitchen where the house guests were sitting around the counter talking. They were all shocked at the sheer audacity of the a-hole as he paraded my wife past them like a sheep to slaughter or a virgin being helplessly offered as a human sacrifice. She looked so vulnerable, so sweet and innocent that a part of me still yearned for her to be mine, even though I would never be able to live with her betrayal, a betrayal that was still nowhere near complete. Kathy followed him up the stairs to his room, her delicate hand in his as the eyes of the remaining house guests looked on in disgust. Step by agonizing step, he claimed my wife as his own, and there wasn't a goddamn thing I could do about it. As much as wanted to, I couldn't get a read on what was going through her mind. She did look somewhat timid, possibly unsure she was doing the right thing, yet there was certainly no sign of resistance and a sparkle in her eyes that suggested she was excited to be alone with him. The feeling in the pit of my stomach indicated there would soon be more permanent mental images to add to my collection of sorrow. You say just look away? Trust me, it's not that easy. I wanted more than anything to be able to turn away, but there was something drawing me in. It was the same with Sarah also. Perhaps it was just the suspension of common sense. I really didn't know. It didn't take long once they reached his room. He stripped and the producers blurred out what they needed to. The cable version was basically unedited, especially the audio, but the video was another story. The blurred out parts saved it from becoming a spicy video, but didn't leave much to the imagination. He held up the covers, inviting my wife into his bed, and she slid under them with the same grace and ease she's used when entering our bed for more than 2 decades. Her face was aglow with 2 emotions, anticipation and lust. At least that's how I would describe it, although I couldn't swear to it because she had never looked at me quite like that. Not with either anticipation or lust, and certainly not both. Soon the pillow talk begins, and one could say it was very enlightening. One would never think that pillow could turn ugly, yet this was no ordinary situation. He begins asking questions, but none of which are overly personal. He's just setting her up for the kill. She does seem somewhat hesitant to answer a couple of his questions, and he assures her that the network would never consider putting this on the air. He knew they would air this on the cable version, but never mentioned it. Then again, why would he? Things had been falling into place perfectly for him all along, though it did help to have someone as gullible as Kathy lying beside him. Yet how could Kathy have forgotten about the cable show? She never missed an episode, and though we never signed up for that particular channel in previous seasons, she definitely saw the promos for it over and over again. That being the case, the better question was probably, when did Kathy get stupid? After a few minutes of teasing her, she tells him his touch feels wonderful. This time she offered up that nugget of heartbreak without even being asked. After a few minutes he asked her if he gave her more pleasure than I do, and she nodded and smiled. After a few more questions he asked one that I never would have thought of in a million years. It was meant to send a husband who was totally helpless over the edge. He asked in a faux caring tone, "Have you ever had an affair?" "What do you mean? Like a long-running affair?" This caught both his attention and mine for the same reason, that being she didn't deny it outright and wanted clarification before answering. He smirked while I felt like I was going to be ill once again. It might be a heart attack or merely vomiting, or possibly both, but something was going to happen. Actually, if I was offered a fatal heart attack at that moment, I would have gladly accepted it and said thank you. She then confessed to having an affair with one of her co-workers when they went to out-of-town conferences. She said she slept with him every night they were away. Thinking back, I remembered her taking just a couple of trips a year, and 4 to 5 nights. When Jake pressed her on the matter, she admitted that the affair lasted about 3 years, and the exhilaration she experienced that first night far exceeded any guilt she may have felt. She also said by the end of the conference, she couldn't wait for the next one. When he asked if there were any others, she acknowledged that she hooked up with one of our married neighbors a few times this past year, but it was never serious. My heart sank yet again. Then he asked the question that almost gave me that heart attack I was now openly rooting for. "Did you ever do it in you and your husband's bed?" "You mean with the neighbor?" "Yes. It was always in our bed at home. He didn't really make enough money to get a room, and I couldn't take the chance of using my credit card and leaving a paper trail." "In your husband's own bed? That's sexy." "Yeah. I have to admit that it was pretty exciting. We mostly met during the day, and that chance we might get caught always heightened the experience." "Wow, that's hot. While your husband's working his butt off for his family, you were making it the neighbor in your marital bed." He smirked. He was now rubbing her nose in her affair for some reason. I started to believe he was sadistic. He then asked, "Did you ever have your neighbor over while your husband was out somewhere with your daughter?" "What do you mean?" It was obvious she was stalling, so while he picked up the pace with his hand, he said, "Well, you told me your daughter played softball in high school. Did your lover come over and make it in your bed while hubby was at her game?" She shook her head and moaned, "No." I had been holding my breath and exhaled loudly when she answered, relieved that she wasn't quite that heartless. My relief was short-lived, as a moment later, she added something that made my heart stop momentarily. "It happened when my husband volunteered to be a chaperone at my daughter's senior prom. My neighbor came over and..." From Sarah's room I heard a shout, "That 304. A part of me wanted to call up to her and tell her not to speak of her mother in those terms. But who the hell am I kidding? The kid nailed it. Sarah's shout drew my attention away from Cathy's admission for a few moments, but soon regained my few remaining senses and pieced together what I had just heard. Actually, my first thought was, did I know my wife at all? After all, never once on the night of chaperoning my daughter's prom did I think she was home clapping cheeks with a married neighbor. Never thought I had a reason to. Speaking of the prom, did I mention that it took only a few weeks before this damn reality show thing started, and that she begged off from helping out because she wasn't feeling well? No. I didn't mention that before, did I? And if you're wondering if I know who neighbor was, the answer's no. Wish I did, though. My last observation might have been more wishful thinking than anything else. As her voice trailed off after saying our neighbor came over for a visit, did I detect a trace of guilt and remorse? I was certain that his nationally televised foreplay had far exceeded even his expectations. She was putty in his hands as he continued his relentless manipulation. And this manipulation worked as a truth serum as Cathy answered all of his questions, including admitting to 2 other affairs. If she had knowledge of any national defense secrets, they too would have been as good as gone. I'm not going to lie. Knowing that another man was responsible for her expression of sheer ecstasy hurt like hell and left me feeling extremely inadequate at being both a husband and lover. I believe Cathy thought this as well and still does. I know I've since accepted it as fact. Anyway, I could tell that she was getting close by the way her breathing increased, and she started to murmur things like, "That's it, baby," right there, and, "Oh God, please don't stop." Then he asked, "When the game is over, are you going to invite me over to see your bedroom?" "Oh yes, baby." "Do you want to show me tonight what you plan on us doing in your husband's bed?" "Oh yeah, baby. I can't wait. I need you inside of me." I could hear things being thrown in Sarah's room. I felt sorry for her and wanted to hold her and tell her everything was going to be all right and this would all blow over. Yet that would be a lie of epic proportions. What's more, what father would want to be in the same room with his daughter under these circumstances? If there was any doubt where this was all headed, it was erased as a whole, prepared to put the finishing touches on the seduction of my wife directly on the national stage. World's been waiting for this moment for almost 2 months, and their patience was about to be rewarded. What happened next happened surprisingly quickly. It also happened surprisingly and scrupulously, even for these two. Jake tells her he doesn't have a condom. Smiling sweetly, she says she feels close enough to him that he doesn't need to wear one if he doesn't want to, unless of course he wasn't interested in her. Well, that was entertainment, at least for everyone who was watching at home, except the husband, which unfortunately was me. It started and ended quickly, but I guess they were both pretty worked up at that point. The floodgates opened as torrent of tears began cascading down my face. I knew I would never be able to erase the images from my mind. I knew for sure that I would never be able to touch that woman again. I was crushed beyond repair, and that fatal heart attack I'd been hoping for was sounding better and better. Although my time in our family house was coming to an abrupt end, I found the thought of spending even one more night in our bed to be repulsive. Instead, I fell asleep on the couch. I awoke at 3 in the morning to use the bathroom only to find myself covered with a blanket. My daughter must have checked on me at some point and covered her dear old dad. She still loved me and was looking out for me, and boy did I need that. When I returned to the couch after my nocturnal relief, I sat there for a while thinking just how much I was going to miss Sarah when she goes to college in Maine this year, but at least I didn't shed a tear over it. Couldn't if I tried. I was all cried out for the time being. The network show returned the next night, and it just so happened to be the last night that Jake was house leader. I obviously didn't give a rat's crap about the game, who was winning, or who was leaving, with the exception of 3 people. Even then the damage was done, but I found it impossible not to watch. In that respect, I guess, I was as bad as the rest of the world. About a half hour into the show, the host Katie Ross gathers the players into the world's watching living room where she'll ask the house guests a few questions. She started with Kathy and asked her if she felt any guilt putting herself in compromising positions with certain young men on the show. As she begins to giggle, Jake puts his arm around her as she explains that she and her husband discussed the possibility that something like this might happen and that he was good with it just as long as it stayed on the show, and that she would return to being his faithful wife once more upon her return. The host then asked if that meant she and her husband had an open marriage, and she giggled once more and replied, "I guess you could call it that." Back at home, Sarah, who was lying on the floor watching with network version with me, turned and asked, "Dad?" Unable to speak, I just shook my head and stared at the screen in anger and disbelief as my formerly faithful wife continued the assault on my heart. Sarah turned back to the TV, satisfied that the unspoken response meant that her mother was lying and that I would never agree to such a thing. We realized that her mother was caught up in the hype and the excitement of the show. Even while others spoke of their families to the point that their eyes were filled with tears, her mother's response was not nearly as heartfelt. She didn't speak of her family much, and when she did, it was almost as if it was scripted and speaking about some generic family other than her own. Sarah would later tell me that she could see the way her mother looked lovingly into Jake's eyes, and it filled her with both shock and disgust. Her heart was breaking, and she couldn't even begin to imagine just how distraught I was. She would say she wanted to turn and look at me to make sure I was okay, but was afraid what she might find. After a few more minutes, a few sniffles followed by a couple of sobs, she got up and left the room. She was only too aware that her world, actually her family's world, had just changed forever, and that nothing would ever be the same. She knew that her mother, her incredibly stupid and selfish mother, was solely to blame. Despite having arguments with her mother in the past over inconsequential things, this week was the first time she ever thought of her as a 304. I was already dead inside, and Sarah knew it, though we were both aware there was nothing she or anyone else could do about it. Then there was the cable feed that same night. Like I said, it was Jake's last night as house leader in his own room. Using baseball terms, I was looking fastball when fate decided to throw me a big old nasty breaking ball. The fastball I was expecting would have been bad enough, but the breaking ball broke, and broke hard, and what it broke was my will to live. Jake and Harley work out a deal. If Harley promised to not put up Jake for eviction, he'd help Harley get together with the once faithful and loving suburban housewife that had become his plaything in the house. Jake says he's going to go lay down for a while and glances at Kathy with a smirk on his face, which is an obvious invitation to join him. She waits for a few minutes before standing up and going into the house, saying she too is tired. This move did not fool the few remaining players, who all looked at each other and continued to call her a 304 behind her back. She climbed the stairs and slowly opened the door, but what she didn't realize in the dark room is that Harley is the one waiting for her in Jake's bed. Again, it happened quickly. This time there was no foreplay, and in a matter of seconds they were going at it hot and heavy under the covers. She finally realized that it wasn't Jake, but she never said a word, never asked him to stop. Soon it was over, but not soon enough. They were both breathless as they lay trying to gain their composure. If Kathy was upset by the switch Jake and Harley pulled off, she didn't show it. In fact, she looked quite happy with the turn of events. I heard the glass breaking and instantly thought that Sarah had thrown and broke something up in her room, but looking over at the liquid running down the living room wall, I realized that I had thrown my glass against the wall. In case you're curious, mine was a straight fastball thrown out of pure frustration. 2 nights later on the network feed, some guy is voted off, but then, who really cares? Then it was time for some competition in the backyard, or whatever the hell they call it. Kathy wins some game answering more inane questions than the others. Kathy is to be house leader for the week. No need for the contingency plans we had arranged with the network. It was on to plan A. After a commercial break, the host welcomes World back to the show. The group of 6 is sitting around the living room when Kathy is told she is allowed a letter from home. I couldn't believe how excited she was, and it actually seemed genuine. Why she was excited I couldn't say. After everything she'd been through on the show, and even her 2 affairs before, you would think having to read a letter from her dull husband would be more of a chore than anything else. Now, I don't want to brag, but I really think I outdid myself with the letter, and I could only hope that Kathy was going to appreciate the time and effort that was put into it. Katie Ross, the host, said, "We have a surprise visitor here to deliver your letter." Kathy put her hands to her mouth in surprise and asked, "Is it James or my daughter Sarah?" Just then a man in a suit stepped through the door and walked up to her and asked, "Are you Kathy and Richardson?" Thinking it was still a part of the show, she giggles and replies, "Yes, I'm Kathy and Richardson." He handed her a large manila envelope and said, "You've been served." A large gasp came from the host, who obviously was not told in advance what was going to happen, and the studio audience that was watching just outside the TV house. There was even a smattering of applause that for some reason did my heart good. Everyone seemed to be in shock, excluding Jake and Harley, who just looked at the camera and smirked. Kathy began to cry and lose control, though being the caring lover that Jake is, he moved over to comfort my wife. He put his arm around her and pulled her body close to his and held her tight and began to whisper to her in a soothing tone. Although I was afar from LA, I did manage to wipe the smirk off Jake's and Harley's faces, at least momentarily, when they received a manila envelope as well. Of course, theirs was for an alienation of affection suit. Her house leadership only lasted for a few minutes, as they were voting 2 people off of the show that night. Some woman was voted off, and then they had another competition and Harley won. While all of this was going on, it was easy to see that Kathy was visibly shaken. She was just going through the motions and didn't quite know what to do, and what was more important, the show or her marriage. In my mind, she might as well try to win the show because the marriage was over. It was not meant to be, and after Kathy was one of the 2 people put up on the chopping block, she was sent packing to go to the pier house, where she'll have to wait for the final night, so she can vote for a winner. It was quite a night. Kathy had figuratively slapped me in the face so many times while on the show that I lost count. But she too got bitch slapped on her way out the door. The deciding secret vote that evicted her was cast in none other than her showmance, Jake. Guess he no longer had a need for her in the house, and was in the way of him collecting $500,000. While in the pier house, she is joined by Jake, as he is the next voted out the following week. There aren't many cameras in the pier house, but while the evicted guests are sitting in the living room, Kathy is sitting in the love seat with Jake, not only by her side, but with his arm around her. When the host asks if they continued the showmance in the new house, Jake immediately and proudly states that they decided to share a bed and that last night was probably the best night of his life. What a prick. There weren't any cameras at the pier house bedroom, so even though I assumed that they continued their dirty little affair, I might not have known for certain. But when Kathy looked down at the floor and turned red, I knew that it was true. God help me, I knew it was true. She continued the showmance in the pier house, and there is no excuse because the game was over for her at this point. There's nothing left for her to play for. Not that going as far as she did was a good enough reason just because it was a game, but even her warped logic couldn't make sense of continuing the affair after she was eliminated from the game. It just became another slap in the face. I thought it was the ultimate slap in the face, but believe it or not, that was still a ways off. Finally, it's the night of the final show. They introduce the players from the pier house, and as they walk out one by one to the loud cheers of the audience, they get to enjoy the last few minutes of their 15 minutes of fame. While not every ovation was loud and enthusiastic. When Harley walked out, the cheer was polite at best with a few boos thrown in. He did not look pleased with the turn of events. Jake was next, and as the booing grew louder, he began to look around to see if maybe someone was going to attack him. His smirk disappeared when it became obvious he was seen as the bad guy. Really? What did he expect? Then Kathy was introduced and walked out in front of the live audience. She faced a few light applause and a few boos, but for the most part it was silence. I couldn't help thinking that the indifference was chilling and worse than getting booed. She sat on a stool next to Jake, but he never attempted to put his arm around her. Could it be the lovebirds had a spat? I hope that wasn't the case because they made such a cute couple and had that great chemistry together. It truly would have been a shame, don't you think? Her eyes seemed to be scanning the crowd as if she was expecting to see her husband and daughter there. That wasn't about to happen. Sarah was already getting settled into her dorm in Maine, and this was my third night in my new apartment in DeLand, Florida. The host acted professionally enough with Kathy during the show's entirety, though it was obvious that neither she nor the audience approved with my wife's actions. That offered me some comfort, but by that time I was pretty much inconsolable. In the end, somebody won, others lost, and the show gave the network its highest ratings ever and second overall to only the Super Bowl that year. Who cares? Kathy eventually contacted my daughter, and Sarah in turn filled me in on what happened after that last show. After trying frantically to call Sarah and me from her hotel in LA to no avail, she then tried her parents and sister with the same result. Kathy's family wasn't about to disown her completely, yet they apparently needed time to digest what had taken place over the last 3 months and weren't open to take her calls just yet. She would later tell Sarah it was then, when no one took her calls, that she began to realize just how much she messed up her life. How she had not seen this before this time is incredible. Hell, there were red flags before she left the house that fateful morning months earlier to catch that damn limo. When Kathy arrived at our airport hoping to find us there to greet her, she instead found herself all alone. She actually had the gall to be angry with me at first for forgetting to pick her up. Forgetting to pick her up? Yeah, right? She took a cab home to find the house dark and both Sarah and my clothes gone from our closets. Kathy told Sarah that she broke down on the spot and cried herself to sleep right there on the bedroom floor. My daughter was the one that called me a few weeks later to say that her 42-year-old mother was pregnant. Hearing something like that should thrill a husband, but not in the case. The simple math told the story that I wasn't the father. It could only be Jake or Harley's. And there it was, the ultimate slap in the face. It took a while to get here, but as I told you earlier, the worst was yet to come. I was already through with my wife. However, my daughter was holding out hope for some kind of a relationship with her mother. Well, her pregnancy ended that. Kathy Richardson was certainly adept to alienating loved ones, friends, and even acquaintances. Nobody could take that away from her. Not exactly a gift from above, but it is what is it? For all of her misdeeds that led to those record-breaking ratings, all she received from the network for a lost marriage and alienation of her once loving husband and daughter was a mere $5,000. Jake and Harley kept their bromance going once the show was over, with Harley moving to Atlanta to share a bachelor pad with Jake. Kathy had her baby girl 3 months ago. Jake proved to be the biological father while she was still pregnant, however, not surprisingly opted to shun any and all responsibility. Though Jake was a complete loser, his family had money and they used that money to have my alienation of affection suits against both he and Harley thrown out. My lawyer warned me that might happen, but it was worth it. Just rattle their cages and expose them for being the scumbags they are. Their lawyers were also successful in convincing a judge that Kathy entrapped poor Jake into having sex with her as part of a game known as World's Watching. In the end, Kathy was awarded zilch and faced yet more backlash from the media, especially the daytime talk shows and syndicated entertainment shows. I did follow the aftermath that followed with a passing interest, though. Sarah is approaching any possible relationship with her new baby sister cautiously. I don't think anyone can blame her for that. She tells me that although she has nothing against the baby, she just can't bring herself to meet her just yet. Sarah admitted that a lot of her resistance stems from not yet being able to face her mother. Though they talk on the phone from time to time, Sarah has no intention of visiting her mother anytime in the near future. Sarah says the phone calls are brief, but not brief enough to suit her. I too have nothing against the baby and was glad to hear she was born happy and healthy and wish her nothing but the best. That said, I have no further interest. This is a topic I no longer wish to discuss with anyone for any reason. I believe the story Dr. Nancy Royce had listened to my story intently, however hadn't spoken much since welcoming me into her office and asking me to relate my side of the story. Now I was just tying up loose ends in the doctor's office saying, so, World's Watching was a rating bonanza and the hot topic for quite a few weeks after the show ended. But eventually all of the fanfare ends and people go on with their lives and our personal horror is all but forgotten by most. Yet there are those of us that will continue to live with it for the rest of our lives. For us it was anything but a game, and if I knew then what I know now, I would have super glued Kathy's goddamn feet to our living room floor. The doctor had a hint of a smile. Who knows, if it wasn't for the show, maybe I would have never found out about the 2 other affairs and we would still be married. Then again, if she cheated before and willing to cheat on me on national television, well, I really don't know what to believe anymore. Anyway, Ever since she came back home, she has been trying to tie up the divorce in every way possible. I wish she would just give it up. Not only won't I ever talk to her again, I have no intention of ever being in the same room with her ever again. That should give a small clue as to my feelings regarding any possible reconciliation. So at our last court appearance, the judge ordered us to counseling with one Dr. Nancy Royce. Of course, this was told to me by my lawyer, as he is handling the entire divorce in my absence. So here I am, doctor. Though I have to tell you, counseling is the last thing I wanted because there isn't any possible way I can ever take Kathy back. The first time, she disrespected me by pressing her lips to that loser. I knew it was over. But at least you're here, Mr. Richardson. Well, it was this or jail time. There won't be a next time, though. You'd prefer jail instead? Not quite, but something like that. She had an expression of concern, though. Let it go for the time being. She then leaned forward and began, Mr. Richardson, I asked you to relate your story as honestly as you could, and I must admit you've impressed me very much. How the hell did I do that? Let's just say I'm so glad that I asked the judge to have an individual session with you. I know you would not have been that open if your wife were present. That's because if my wife were here, I'd still be in Florida. Just the same, you were very open with me, and I truly appreciate that. I must admit that the husband usually comes into my office ranting and raving about his wife and blaming her for everything wrong in their marriage. But you didn't do that. She hesitated for a moment before continuing. No, Mr. Richardson. You concentrated more on your emotions and the emotions of your daughter. That was very telling and went a long way to earning my trust. I didn't know I was supposed to be building trust with you. She laughed and said, that's the best way. That's why I booked such a long session. I really wanted to get to know you, and I think we accomplished that. She paused once again, then added, would you mind very much if I told you my theory as to why your wife acted the way she did? You managed to form your humble opinion just by looking at court records and a solo meeting with my wife? Doesn't seem like much to work with from my point of view. No, Mr. Richardson, my humble opinion, as you put it, isn't formed solely on the transcripts given to me by the judge in your divorce proceedings or one meeting with Mrs. Richardson. In truth, I've been treating with your wife for nearly a year. That surprised me. I don't mean to offend you, Doc, but this sounds like a setup. Believe me, it's not. I'll leave it at that. And Kathy is aware that I would be talking to you sometime soon and has told me that I was allowed to disclose any and everything that we've talked about to date. May I? I just nodded. She could sense that I was less than enthused to hear anything sounding like a flimsy excuse or any psychobabble. She saw this and quickly added, I know you're skeptical, Mr. Richardson, and no, I am not suggesting that you accept what I'm about present as an excuse for your wife's actions. In fact, I have no intention of suggesting you accept any explanation for your wife's actions. All I ask is that you keep an open mind and hear me out. Can you do that for me? I simply nodded for her to continue. Mr. Richardson, there's little doubt that Kathy got caught up in a perfect storm. It began with the whole idea of being on the show and progressed from there. She wasn't just a fan that enjoyed watching the show. You already knew that. Your wife seemingly lived to appear on that show. In her mind, from the moment she was chosen to be on Worlds Watching, she was in a fantasy world. When she opened the mailbox that fateful day, she basically became another person. We've been working hard to figure out why she would allow herself to become this other person. She removed the cap off of her bottle of water and took a sip. I do have a possible explanation or explanations as to why she may have gotten so close to this other man while she was away from you. Although I'm the first to admit that we have yet to establish the definitive answer we all seek, I truly believe we're moving in the right direction. I didn't speak, so she continued, it's a very complex situation, and I'm afraid anything I say will be difficult for you to hear. Go on, I said after clearing my throat, though immediately questioning my decision. I've heard of cases like this before, though I'm the first to admit that I never seen it happen so quickly. I have a theory about that as well, but perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. That's when I said with a smile, come on, Doc, spit it out. I have places to be and things to do. She could tell my remark was just a good-natured jab, so she smiled back and continued. Mr. Richardson, I believe that your wife had a difficult time in separating this reality TV show from reality itself. I believe that deep down she missed you terribly, but couldn't figure out a way to show her remorse leaving you behind. Seriously? She misses me, so she became Jake's woman instead? She leaned back and smiling slightly said, you're very perceptive, because that's exactly what I mean. That is the biggest boatload of crap I have ever heard. That woman knew right from wrong. Maybe not as much as you might expect. I think she clung on to him in your absence. As you said, she became his woman while she was on the show. It allowed her to feel protected and loved, just as she is when she was home with you and your daughter. So, If she was looking to replicate her family in the show, why didn't she adopt a daughter to go along with a new man? She chuckled a bit before answering, once again, very perceptive. I was confused and proved it with my next brilliant question. What? You're on the right track. I went back and watched the entire season and noticed that she was getting closer to the one young woman even though she was on another team, or whatever they call it. She was becoming motherly until the girl was voted off the show early on. I believe that by her temporarily adopting a new family, it helped her cope with the stress of being on the show. But she wanted to be on the show, lived for it in fact. I agree, but subconsciously she probably felt a terrific amount of guilt about leaving you and your daughter behind. Having this Jake guy and the other young lady gave her back some of the comfort she was missing in her life. Listen, doctor, this whole guilt and replicating family thing, I don't need to listen to this psychobabble. Guilty on leaving the family, should not have left in the first place, cheating with another man, should have thought of the consequences. Also the other affairs that she admitted, were they part of her trying to replicate the reality as well? So no, I do not buy the load of bullcrap that she is selling. Tell me, doc, do you really believe that she was trying to replicate her family on TV? She just shook her head and gave me time to let that sink in before I said, so you really believe her? Is that correct? On a purely temporary basis. Unfortunately, when the show ended, reality hit her right between the eyes. She didn't understand that what she was doing was wrong even if it was temporary. And she certainly didn't understand how what she was doing might look to others. Just look at how oblivious she was to most of the remarks from her fellow housemates. I wasn't buying it. People who cannot separate real life and television should be put in a mental institution. After a long pause, she said, there is another possibility, and quite honestly, it's something that could either play a part in what I had just laid out or work independent in and of itself. Either way, I'm certainly not going to be doing you or your wife any favors by telling you this. I asked the obvious question, what's that, doctor? She hesitated and took a deep breath. There is a chance that somewhere along the line, she totally fell out of love with you. She could read the sadness on my face. It wasn't like I never thought of it myself. In fact, I often assumed it was the reason she did what she did, or at least part of the reason. But to hear it from a person qualified to form such assessments stung quite a bit. Please, Mr. Richardson, there's a good chance that this is not the case. You yourself said that until she opened the mailbox that day that there didn't appear to be anything wrong between the two of you, outside of the occasional spat or two. What's more, her falling out of love with you would certainly not explain how she could walk away from her daughter, not to mention her sister and parents. But falling out of love would help explain her other affairs, wouldn't it? Shaking her head, she replied, not necessarily, but it's something that can't be ruled out. It's difficult to say, really. Well, that I guess that almost kind of explains it, sort of. She laughed good-naturedly. I'm sorry, Mr. Richardson. That certainly wasn't one of my most, shall I say, compelling answers. Here's the thing, Doc. Having to watch her be seduced like I did on national TV was bad enough, don't you think? But then I have to listen to her calmly. Got that? Calmly tell her new lover of her previous affairs. Hell, I've heard her talk about a grocery list with more emotion, and never once was there even a hint of remorse. I knew she was having her buttons pushed at the time, but she still managed to confess pretty damn calmly. I stopped and took a deep breath, then added, how can anyone do that to someone they supposedly love? The answer is they can't. And if she had these affairs during our marriage, that means that she never actually loved me. There was silence for nearly a minute. Finally, she broke the silence with, I'd like to tell you baby steps, Mr. Richardson, that we are in the early stages of treating Mrs. Richardson. I'd be lying if I said I had all the answers. Face it, Doc, you're not really all that convinced she still loves me anymore either. Are you? You know that she is a rotten apple, right? She is an immoral woman who would open her legs at any chance that she gets. She is just toying with this mental treatment thing. Women like her should be on the streets, making money while doing what she loves. That way she could have a new life, new reality with every new man. Why get married and waste my good years? She thought for a moment before offering a measured answer. Well, I think she loves the idea of being married to you, Mr. Richardson. Really, I wish you could come up with something better than that bullcrap. I have started to doubt your capabilities as a doctor. So do I, Mr. Richardson. So do I. I shook my head. Most people don't have learn about their spouse's infidelity on national TV. So when you think about it, I guess there's not much real about reality shows. Is there? No, there isn't, and I'm afraid Mrs. Richardson is learning that the hard way. There was an uncomfortable silence, which was immediately followed by more uncomfortable conversation. I would appreciate the opportunity to help you as well. I would like nothing more than to ease your pain and in doing so possibly make your marriage whole again. I sat there staring at her diplomas hanging on the wall, not knowing what to say. Mr. Richardson, I've already told you that my work with your wife is far from over, but I truly believe she can return to being the woman you fell in love with and married. No, hell no. Kathy obviously was never the woman I thought she was when we married. She belongs to the streets, and I made a mistake by getting married to her, I snapped at her. I paused for a moment before continuing. Don't get me wrong, this isn't about revenge on my wife. I don't wish anything bad to happen to her, except for her to die of a severe case of STD. I really don't, and if you think you can help her, I say go for it, but you're going to have to do it without me. I'm done caring. My love for that 304 is dead. You can waste your time to help her cope up, but read my lips. She is a woman who belongs on the streets. She is a 304 and will always remain that. No amount of help can fix her. A crocodile will remain a crocodile. You cannot help it to become a dog and play fetch. Good luck wasting your time with her. After more silence, I added, please, doctor, haven't my daughter and I suffered enough? This whole thing has been pure torture, and it seems that the only person anyone really cares about is the person that caused all of this in the first place. What about Sarah and me? I don't mean to be selfish, but how the hell are we supposed to carry on with our lives? How is Sarah holding up? As you know, Sarah is attending an out-of-state college and adjusting about as well as can be expected. I'm very thankful for that. She still has her friends back home, but also new friends, and her life is turning around. I don't know what the future holds for her, but she's proven to be one tough young lady. What about you, Mr. Richardson? How are you holding up? Have you moved on? I hesitated while searching for an answer. It wasn't cut and dry. I'm trying, Doc. I certainly am trying. You're already aware I had moved to Florida before the show even ended, and I'm still there. I couldn't remain in our hometown. Everyone meant well, but seeing those looks of pity wherever I went, I paused, not even bothering to finish nor continue my last thought. My lawyer handles as much as he can for me, but sometimes that's impossible, like this counseling session, for example. I had to fly in for it, and will have to do so for any future sessions. Wouldn't it be worth it if we can save your marriage? Are you kidding me? Who gives you guys a certificate to practice? No logically thinking man would touch that woman with a 10-foot pole. My marriage was dead when she started screwing with others. I would rather marry a skunk than be near her. There's nothing to save this marriage. She threw it all away for the chance to be on a TV show. How shallow is that? Then to top it all off, she still insists on asking my daughter and I why we just can't forgive her for wanting to live out her dream. Well, now she's free to appear on any other reality show, start her OnlyFans account, become a spicy star. Although at her age I doubt people will pay to see her body. Even if she wants or shack up with some young stud that rocks her world, she's free to do so. Since I never made her satisfied, she is free to get ultimate satisfaction with any man she wants. I won't stand in her way ever again. With a caring voice she asked, despite all that happened, do you still love your wife, Mr. Richardson? I took a deep breath and sighed before repeating the question and replying, do I still love my wife? Yes, I do, but I hate her more than I love her. So, in a way, she is dead to me. She cocked her head to the side like a puppy not understanding a command. I must say that's a very interesting point of view. I don't believe I've ever heard someone say they loved someone and hated them and they are dead to them in the same breath. Could I ask you to expand on that for me? It's not that hard to understand, really. Did you ever have someone close to you? Someone you truly love? Die? Yes, but... I asked, did you stop loving them? Dr. Royce smiled slightly and simply replied, no. I looked down at my hands and continued, I do have some love for her and always will. I just can't shut that off no matter how hard I wish I could. But I finally had to accept I lost her. It breaks my heart to admit it, and it took a while, but I managed to do it. She's no longer mine, and as it turns out, never truly was, at least not entirely. I took a moment to collect my thoughts, and she allowed me the time and space to do so. It might not have been that way if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. All of it. Hell, I would have never known about the affairs if I hadn't have watched. I mean, I guess someone else could have told me, but... My voice trailed off again. She sat there for a minute, watching me struggle with my own thoughts before breaking the silence. I know you said it was difficult to turn away from the broadcast, Mr. Richardson, but can you tell me why you felt compelled to watch? I didn't want to watch. God knows I didn't, but I couldn't look away. It was like watching one of those wildlife shows, and you see the cute zebra about to get taken down by the lion. You want to stop it in some way, yell at the TV to make the poor defenseless animal aware it's about to be attacked. Yet there's nothing you can do about it, and you can't look away. Kathy was that prey, and that a-hole was the predator, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it but watch. Perhaps in time, if the judge does grant a divorce, you can find someone special. I shook my head. I don't think so. Maybe the pain will fade some. I hope it does. But I'm not so sure about those images. Those goddamned images of Kathy and those guys. My mind even tricks me into picturing her with the guys from her 2 affairs, and that's only my imagination. I don't see how I could ever trust another woman again. No offense, of course. None taken. But you do know it was on the news that the network is being flooded with letters from all over the world from women wanting to meet you. Just what I need. A chance let down another woman. You can't mean that. Can't I? You heard the things she said about me with the whole world listening. I paused, and to her credit, Nancy Royce made no effort to speak, instead giving me time to finish my thoughts. I was a bit choked up as I continued. I'll never forget hearing those 2 guys planning and then carrying out my wife's seduction while I watched helplessly from 3,000 miles away. And all the while there was nothing I could do about it. Nothing. But the worst part was watching my wife giving them those loving touches, those loving looks that were once intended for me and me alone. My God, Doc, how it hurt to see the lust and love in her eyes as the show continued, knowing that that lust and love was directed at others. Then to see her eyes glazed over while lost in the moment as another touched, caressed, and kissed her, followed by the ecstasy on her face as someone other than me pleasured her. How can anyone ever expect me to forgive and forget? I looked up the doctor to find a tear in her, I then asked. And then there was that one moment that made my heart stop completely and made me wish I was dead. As incredible as it may seem, it wasn't the foreplay, the sex, or even hearing about the other affairs. I choked up, wondering if I could relate what I wanted to without completely breaking down. My voice cracked at the outset, then all the way through my confession. That one worst moment when my heart stopped was when my wife, the only lover I've ever had and the mother of my daughter, allowed herself to be paraded past a room full of people like a sacrificial sheep by someone other than her husband, and showing the world, and especially me, that she now belonged to another. Then to see that look of anticipation in her eyes as she followed that a-hole up the stairs to his bedroom and the end of her marriage, and all the while knowing that I was nowhere in her thoughts. I then summed up my frustration with, and now some judge, a complete stranger with no real knowledge of the situation, thinks it's best if we kiss and make up and let bygones be bygones. So tell me, Doc, is my life going to be turned upside down once a week just to attend some meaningless counseling? Again, no offense. She said nothing, instead casting her eyes down to her notes. I couldn't help think that she wished she was anywhere else on the planet at that moment. So Dr. Royce, that's my story. You wanted to hear my story, so there it is. Do with it as you will. But please know that if you suggest another meeting, or worse yet, order one, especially one where my wife will be in attendance, you and she will both be disappointed. Truth is, I would rather take my own life than ever speak with her again, and if it comes to it, I will. It's not a threat, just a certainty. I felt a tear run down my cheek as the effects of reliving my own personal nightmare took its toll. She stared at me for nearly a minute without speaking. It was clear she was trying to gauge my resolve before finally looking down at her notes while slowly shaking her head. Then she slowly leaned back into her big leather chair and placed the fingertips of both hands together as if she were praying. She hesitated, but finally said, "I don't think that having you attend any more sessions will be necessary, Mr. Richardson." She then leaned forward and closed the file, and as she met my gaze said, "I agree with you. I think both you and your daughter have been through more than enough this past year, and quite frankly, I don't know of anyone that would be able to cope with all of this, let alone forgive and forget. In many ways, you're a remarkable man, Mr. Richardson." "I don't feel so remarkable. Hell, I don't feel anything anymore." She paused momentarily before adding, "I'll advise the court that the marriage is beyond repair. I sincerely hope you can put your life together, if only for your daughter's sake." I just nodded my head and sat quietly, breathing a sigh of relief that someone other than my daughter finally considered my feelings. "Before you go, Mr. Richardson, there are a couple of things I would like to discuss." She looked back at me and began, "You made no attempt to hurt your wife, either physically or financially. Fact is, aside from keeping your retirement account and your car, you gave your wife everything else, including the house, her car, and all of bank accounts. That's very impressive, Mr. Richardson. I will tell you that your wife was pleasantly surprised and appreciates it greatly." I nodded in acknowledgement, saying, "She suffered enough. She was treated like a pariah by her own family, all of our friends, and pretty much the rest of the world. I don't want to hurt her any more than she already was, though there isn't any way I can be around her any longer. I just want out. Thank you for seeing that." I paused for a moment before adding, "Do me a favor, Doc. I haven't known you all that long, but I trust you. Probably more than I should, but I trust you. If I ask you a question, will you give me an honest answer?" She looked into my eyes and said, "Yes, Mr. Richardson, if I know the answer, that is. You've been very open with me, and I think I owe it to you. I nodded and continued. I noticed you're wearing a wedding ring. She smiled. Yes, I am Mr. Richardson, but I suppose that's not the question you needed answered. I smiled. Now you're being perceptive. She laughed. Thank you. My pleasure. I replied, then added, I just want to know that if it were your husband on the show, and he did to you what Kathy did to me, all things being equal, including some of the reasons you believe she did it. I paused and she completed my question. If I would have forgiven him and taken him back in? I smiled sadly and nodded. She smiled back and while shaking her head said, Not a chance. I could see how crushed you were by all of this, and let me just say I feel for you. I don't believe I would have reacted any differently to anything you've told me. She hesitated before adding, I know yours is just one side of the story, but in this case I can view tapes of what took place, so don't have to take your word for it. I too saw it with my own eyes. I only needed to gauge your emotions. What's more, your wife has admitted to most of it also. She paused before saying, I'm not sure how to approach this, Mr. Richardson, so let me just say there are still some things that are bothering me about the fallout from all of this. Would you mind staying a bit longer with me and talking about it? I can assure you that it will have no bearing whatsoever on my decision, and that whatever we talk about will be completely off the record. Doctor, patient privilege, if you will. She paused and took a sip of water, leaving me to wonder where the conversation was headed. Actually, I had a pretty good idea, though I was hoping it wouldn't come up. So I shrugged, then nodded for her to continue. There were a couple of incidents in the file from the court where the authorities originally cited you as a person of interest. She looked up at me, but I remained stone-faced and silent. She continued while looking down at her notes. The first involved one of your neighbors just prior to you moving to Florida. Apparently, he was attacked coming out of a bowling alley one night. He originally told police that he recognized you as his attacker, though his wife swore that it was two much shorter men. She raised her eyes to mine, possibly hoping for a reaction that was not meant to be. She continued, the police report states that his wife made multiple references to the fact that her husband had an affair with an unidentified woman from the neighborhood. I remained silent. You were never questioned since the wife was so adamant it wasn't you. Within a few days, her husband changed his story and police should look for two shorter men. I sat quietly. This was also in the file from the court. Apparently, two men from the reality show, World's Watching, were found severely beaten in an alley outside of an Atlanta nightclub. Authorities said that though both Jay Kinney and Harley Bodine were expected to survive their injuries, both were left bleeding with multiple fractures and serious concussions. She paused for a moment, gauging my reaction, and when there was none, continued. The part of the report that truly caught my attention was where I read they sustained extensive and permanent damage to their genitalia. Surgeons were unable to save any portion of their reproductive organs. Investigators claim their attacker would most likely had to have a personal interest to deliver such violent beatings. I wouldn't know anything about that. I really don't watch the news. Life sucks enough without having to be force-fed other people's problems on top of your own. Dr. Royce flashed a knowing smile as she continued, I read they wanted to question you as a person of interest, Mr. Richardson, but that despite matching the description of the assailant, you had an airtight alibi. I remained silent once more. According to the story, you were on a friend's boat in the Florida Keys the entire weekend of the attacks. You didn't tell me you made a new friend in Florida and that your friend is a local judge. Well, you never asked me. But it's not really a secret, especially since it's been printed in newspaper. He's a good friend and we have a lot in common. His wife cheated on him also, and then raked him over the coals. Not quite the same situation that I was in, but then again I would think mine might be just a bit on the unique side. Still smiling, she said, You know, I would like to remind you of doctor, patient confidentiality. With a hint of a smile, I simply replied, Okay, this certainly isn't going to be my shining moment professionally speaking, so I hope you're not going to think less of me. It's just that I wanted so badly for those three to get theirs and see the good guy win. She paused while searching for the right words. I'm not even sure how to ask this, but I've never been so intrigued by anything in my life. I've got this gut feeling and I just wish you could confirm if... She stopped and sighed as if having second thoughts on asking a question that may be considered in poor taste. It was my turn to finish her sentence. If I'm the one that put Jake, Harley, and my neighbor in their place? She nodded ever so slightly. I rose from the chair, then turned and took a few steps toward the door. I stopped and turned to face her, and I could see the disappointment in her eyes as she looked into mine, almost searching in desperation for the answer she so much wanted to hear. I took a deep breath and with trace of satisfaction said, Always go with your gut. She smiled broader than I ever thought possible, saying, I wish you well, Mr. Richardson. Tell your daughter I said hello and that she has one hell of a father. The smile I returned was considerably smaller, but but heartfelt just the same as I replied, "Take care, Doc." I walked out of her office to what was left of my life. It was 6 years after the show and 5 years after the divorce. Life went on. Sarah had just put her baby down for a nap when the front doorbell rang. She quietly walked through the house hoping that whoever is at the door is not so impatient as to ring the bell again and wake up Stephen James Densmore. He was a little over a year old, but he captured her heart the first time she laid eyes on him. Though right now Sarah really needed him to take a nap. She smiles as she thinks of her husband Ross and the way they met 3 years ago at school. Though neither were raised in Maine, they both fell in love with the area and decided to stay there after graduation. They were married a few weeks out of college, and nearly a year later their son entered their lives. Life has not just gone on for her. It's been pretty darn good recently, but that wasn't always the case, and once in a while has visions of her mother's humiliating appearance on a nationally televised reality show. Even after 6 years, she and her mother only talk about once a month, and for only about 10 minutes at the most. Thus far, she's managed to keep their conversations extremely generic, though she believes her mother is itching to say more. Sarah knows someday she'll probably have to hear her out, but would like to put it off for as long as possible. She does get to the door before the bell sounds again, and is astonished to see a woman standing with an expression of nervous anticipation laced with more than a bit of doubt and hopefulness. "Mother?" Sarah asked this, almost not believing her eyes, but her thought was, damn. Ready or not, that someday I've been dreading is here. Kathy looked a bit thinner than Sarah remembered, but overall appeared healthy and well. Not expecting her mother to just show up and unsure of what to do next, she instinctively took a step back and said, "Won't you come in?" Kathy did just that and was soon following her daughter into the living room. "Can I get you some coffee or tea or?" "Coffee would be fine if it's not too much trouble." Sarah went into the kitchen to prepare a couple of cups while also using the time to collect her thoughts. Right now those thoughts were bouncing around her head like a Super Bowl in a phone booth. She had no idea how to approach the impending conversation and knew if she ever had to wing anything, now was the time. As Sarah was returning to the living room, her mother said, "You and Ross have a very nice house, dear." "It's not what I pictured, though. It's larger than I thought it would be." "Thank you. Ross put a lot of work into it." Sarah then sat on the opposite end of the couch than her mother. "I hope I'm not imposing on you too much, sweetheart, but I really wanted to see my grandson. He's napping right now, but maybe we can take a peek later." Sarah placed her cup on the table for a moment, then asked, "Did you bring your daughter on the trip?" "No. She's back home with Grandma. I wasn't sure you wanted to, see her." Sarah simply nodded. Kathy then added, "Maybe I'll bring her next time, if you'll let me have a next time." Sarah frowned. "Let's play it by ear. I'm not all that thrilled with this visit, let alone anything in the future." She could see her mother was disappointed and quickly added, "I guess I really should meet my kid sister, though." Then Sarah thought and added, "And I do mean kid sister." Kathy smiled cautiously, not wanting to do or say the wrong thing. Sarah's response was actually more than she expected. "It's just that I wasn't sure you would want to see her. I mean, well, It's okay, Mother. We'll see how it goes today and go from there. She's 5 now, right?" Kathy sniffled a bit and said, "I'd like that. I really would, and yes, she's 5. Despite everything that's happened, sweetheart, I would love for you to meet your sister." "Mother, I just want you to know that I don't have anything against Lisa. It's just..." "Oh, honey, I understand. Believe me, I do." Kathy flashed a sad smile, but a smile just the same. Sarah thought, "My mother's child is 4 years older than mine. Nope, this isn't going to be too awkward. Lucky for us, the entire country already knows our family history." "Yep, lucky for us." Sarah knew what was coming and her stomach was turning at the thought of it. She still wasn't sure what she was going to say if her mother brought up the subject of her father, but she knew that's why she was here. That, and to see her grandson. Kathy took a deep breath and asked, "How is your father, dear?" And there it was, thought Sarah. Time to address the big elephant in the room. She replied a bit louder than she intended. "He's fine, Mother. We're all fine." "Is that what you wanted to hear? You came all the way to Maine to hear me tell you my father's fine. By the way, that was a nice segue, very subtle." After a long silence, Kathy asked, "Sarah, please, sweetheart, I need to talk to you about this. If you don't have any love in your heart for me, I understand, but need to talk to you about this. Dr. Royce wanted me to do this long ago, but I told her I wasn't ready then. A part of me knew that you weren't ready either." Sarah looked away from her mother and stared at the wall. "What makes you think I'm ready now?" Sniffling, Kathy replied, "I'm just hoping that you are. I know things will never be the same between us, but I just can't go on calling my baby to talk about the weather. I need you in my life, Sarah." Sarah looked back at her mother, and it seemed that she was sincere if nothing else. I want to tell you everything I know. Can't we just have a normal conversation for once? I promise I won't hold anything back, even though you may not like some of the answers. Please, honey. Sarah was less than thrilled with how her day was working out so far, but decided to make an effort at a normal conversation with her mother. However, if she was going to do this, she wanted to at least ease into their first conversation since she graduated high school. After a long, awkward silence, Sarah spoke. So the last time we talked you said that Nancy Royce was retiring. She knew the question sounded ridiculous as soon as she asked. Out of all the things she could talk about, she led with this. It really was almost as bad as talking about the weather, but she had to start somewhere. The best analogy she could make was that it was like entering a pool slowly to give yourself some time to get used to the water temperature. Her first question amounted to putting her big toe into the upcoming conversation. Yes, she is retired. You know that I haven't seen her professionally in a couple of years, but we did stay in touch. Kathy realized her daughter was tossing her some softball questions and was appreciative. Sarah then asked, I thought you said she wasn't that old. She has a medical condition. She's going to be all right, but her family doctor suggested she retire since her job is so stressful. Kathy smiled nervously and added, Guess I didn't help her cause much, did I? Sarah frowned, guessing not. Kathy then said, It was probably from watching all of those clips from the show with me. She made you watch clips from the show? Yes, she did. Then we discussed my actions. Sarah surprised herself with her own compassion by replying, Hope you enjoyed screwing your marriage on live TV. Kathy nodded and said, Aside from signing the divorce papers, it was the hardest thing I ever had to do. All I could think of was that while I was doing those unspeakable things, you and your father were home watching it on television. She quickly reached for her purse and took out a tissue and dabbed her eyes with it. It just wasn't Dad and me, Mother. I know that, dear. It was the rest of our family and all our friends. And the rest of the country. Sarah jumped in. Kathy sniffled. Yeah, that was embarrassing, all right. But it was nothing compared to what I did to you and your father. Your father especially. My God, Sarah, I'm so sorry I don't even know where to begin. Sarah looked surprised. That's the first time I've heard you apologize. I've tried. Oh, how I've tried. That was one of the reasons I tried to hold up the divorce. I just wanted to tell your father in a face-to-face meeting just how sorry I was. Not that I deserved that chance, of course, but her voice trailed off. Sorry or not, how could you have done this to us? Kathy closed her eyes and began. Let me start at the beginning. Would that be all right? You've got the floor. Kathy took a deep breath and began. You were 5 and had just gone back to school when I decided to keep busy by going back to work and put my college degree to good use. There was a man in my office that was really good looking and enjoyed doing things that I only dreamed of. He traveled to exotic places and ate at the finest restaurants and hobnobbed with the elite. I was impressed, and before I knew it, I was flirting with him. So you threw away everything for his so-called Mr. Right? That's just it, sweetheart. He wasn't even the one I had the affair with. He was just the guy that got my motor running is all. Against my better judgment, I began fantasizing about having an affair. It's ironic when I look back on it now and realize he wasn't even interested in me and actually turned out to be a faithful husband like your dad. Then who did you have the affair with? Well, I began to travel with my job. Not much, just a couple of times a year. It was at a conference in Dallas that I met this guy from our Boston office. She paused for a moment. I'm sorry, Sarah. This is very difficult for me to talk about, especially to my daughter. To Sarah's credit, she gave her mother the time she needed to pull herself together. She regained her composure and continued. His name was Douglas. But Dr. Royce said it could have been most anybody at that point. She believes I was already looking to have an affair, and she was absolutely right. Anyway, he invited me down to the bar one night, and a few drinks later we were up in his room dancing to a song he was humming. Sarah rolled her eyes. Sure didn't take much to sweep you off your feet, did it? Oh, Sarah. I still can't believe I did it, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up the next morning in his hotel room with a hangover and the worst case of guilt I ever thought possible. I tell you, if your father had seen me the next day, he would have known immediately what I had done and divorced me then. Would have deserved it too. The next day at the conference, Douglas was the perfect gentleman, or so I thought. Can you believe that it was Dr. Royce who convinced me that this guy never had any real feelings for me? Damn it, Sarah. A grown woman like me couldn't see it until almost 2 decades later. Pausing for a moment, she went on. So the next day, he sweet-talked me enough to go to dinner with him, and I don't have to tell you what happened then. You ended up in his bed. Yep, I ended up in his bed. Only this time it felt a bit different. When I woke up in the morning, the guilt was still there, only not nearly as strong. The guilt was being replaced by excitement. Excitement from sleeping with a man other than your father. Are you trying to say you didn't know it was wrong? Of course I knew it was wrong, but it was the excitement of having an affair and that your father would never know about it. We spent a couple of more nights together before heading home. Then the guilt returned. How do you explain meeting with him again at other conferences? I can't, Sarah, that's just it. In between those conferences I'd be fine and somehow manage to block out the cheating. But a couple of weeks before each conference he would call or email me at work and remind me of the fun we had in Dallas or another conference. Of course, I would casually forget about the guilt and potential for ruining my marriage. I shouldn't be telling you this, but, well, it wasn't about the sex. Your father is a kind and gentle man in every way, and what I did had nothing to do with him. It was all about the thrill of doing something I shouldn't be doing. Did Dad ever meet him, at a company party or something? No, never. Why did you stop seeing him? You did stop seeing him, didn't you, Mother? He was fired for certain indiscretions with female employees in the home office. One was with CEO's wife. Not the best career move, was it? No, it wasn't, dear. Yet here I was thinking I was somebody special to him, and he was chasing every skirt he saw. I heard through the grapevine that he had been killed in an automobile accident. That must have been 10 years ago or more. By that time, our rendezvous had been over for quite some time. Which one of you decided to stop? Believe it or not, it was me. Guilt actually crept its way back in, and I decided to turn my attention back to my family. The room grew quiet for a few moments until Sarah asked, "Then why an affair with our neighbor, Mr. Barnes?" Kathy sighed. This was a different situation. Your father had been working a lot of overtime, and when he wasn't working, he was going to your softball games and other activities of yours. So this is all my fault? Oh God, no, honey. This has nothing to do with you or your father. It's just that for years your father was spending a lot of time with me, and even though he is not the most exciting guy in the world, I was content and used to his company. At least that's what I told myself. But when he started spending more time away from me, I once again became that selfish person I truly am. I started going out with the girls from work once in a while, and your father never said a word. Why? He trusted me. And what do? I go out and betray that trust in an unspeakable manner. Kathy stopped for a moment to blow her nose and then continued. Only this time, it wasn't an affair with Mr. Barnes. It was only the one time. We met at the bar while I was out with the girls, and he was everything your father wasn't. He loved to dance, was incredibly outgoing, and the life of the party. Certainly sounds like the kind of man a happily married woman should throw her family under the bus for. Sarah's tone was filled with sarcasm. Kathy shook her head. At the time, I was spending a lot of time comparing your father's perceived faults to other men's perceived strengths. It was a fight no man could win. Hell, the faults I came up with weren't really faults at all. I thought at times he was not attentive enough, or not sensitive to my needs. Dr. Royce showed me that they were just weak-minded excuses to cheat and nothing more. Just like the first affair, my motor was running, and the one time I slept with Mr. Barnes wasn't enough to get it out of my system. Let's just say Mr. Barnes didn't do it for me. In fact, Dr. Royce suggested by this time it was like my libido was on steroids, and it was also at this time when I was contacted by the show. Being chosen to be on that show was the ultimate case of be careful what you wish for. I was so primed to have an affair I even rubbed it in your faces before I left by hinting that I might start flirting with other men, or possibly even more. Dr. Royce suggested that I was so full of myself at that point that my arrogance knew no bounds. You were full or something, Mother, but I'm not so sure it was yourself. Kathy smiled. You've got your father's sense of humor. I like that. Kathy paused again and then continued. I won't go into the details of what happened. You saw for yourself that I crossed the line many times over of what is expected of a married woman. Hell, from the beginning my fantasies totally took over my warped mind to the point that I was no longer playing the game that I so wanted to be on. Before I knew it, I was in too deep. Sarah shot back, Jesus, Mother. One guy was bad enough, but what about the night with that other a-hole, Harley? Kathy shook her head and began. Not that this is going to make it sound any better, but I thought it was Jake. By the time I found out it wasn't, well, I was too far gone if you know what I mean. I'm sorry to have to admit this to you, but I couldn't stop at that point. Kathy sighed. But the thing that hurt most of all was the night of the live broadcast from our house. I was absolutely crushed when the cameras were turned on and I saw the empty room and couch. They explained it that they were having technical difficulties, but I knew then they were just covering up for the fact that my family abandoned me. Those were my first thoughts. Can you believe that? I thought my family abandoned me, not the other way around. Sarah just looked at her mother as a single tear ran down Kathy's cheek. It wasn't until nearly a week later that I began looking at things quite differently. Maybe you could call it an epiphany, I don't really know, but I began to look at the situation for what it was. Believe me, I was horrified by my actions when I did. Kathy then broke down and cried harder than she thought she ever could. Sarah wasn't sure how to react. She still harbored many ill feelings towards her, but this woman was after all her mother, and her breaking down certainly wasn't some kind of an act. Once she regained her composure enough to speak, she continued, "The night I started to come to my senses, I went back to my bedroom on the show and realized just how foolish I acted. I should have come home then to try to salvage what was left of my marriage, but there probably wasn't much left of it, was there?" Sarah answered honestly, no, didn't think so. So I stayed hoping to win the money. I figured your father would divorce me, and I would need some money to start my life over. Then when I was voted off, I figured I would go to the pier house to collect my pittance. Hell, I knew my life was over and $5,000 was better than nothing. Sarah was livid. "Damn it, mother. You still had the nerve to sleep with that a-hole when you left the house." Kathy shook her head and said, "I know that's the way it looked on TV, but that's not what actually happened. I watched the tape in the doctor's office and know what you mean. Jake told the entire nation that we had spent the night together at the pier house, but that was a lie. Why didn't you deny it then?" I was too ashamed of myself to offer any kind of an argument, so I just hung my head and said nothing. I just wanted to get out of there and go home, but home was not going to be anything like it was before I left. Sarah, when I walked across that stage that last night and heard booing, I knew that everyone saw what really happened. I was devastated. She sighed and added, "You know what, Sarah? You know how you think of something random at the strangest moments." Sarah said nothing. "Well, this Jake." She cringed at saying his name, put his arms around my shoulders to comfort as they were going to break. "I thought about the morning I left the house and didn't even kiss your father goodbye." Sarah shook her head and shot back. "Would have been nice if you realized that at the time. Kinda late now, don't ya think?" Kathy could only nod. She had no answer. Sarah broke the brief silence with, "I have another question, Mother. You told me when you landed and no one was at the airport greet you. You got angry. Same goes at the house. I mean, really, what the hell did you expect?" Looking her daughter in the eye, she answered, "I was afraid. Afraid of my family leaving me and afraid that I would be on my own the rest of my life. Dr. Royce believed I was angry with myself and looking to blame others." "Mother, there is another question I just have to ask." Kathy nodded for her daughter to continue. "How in the hell did you not know World was watching when the show was called World's Watching? I mean, how is that even possible?" Kathy shook her head and said, "Because I believed everything I was told. I was stupid, Sarah. Plain and simple. I was stupid." She paused and took a deep breath and continued. "What Jake said made sense at the time. Of course, I was so caught up in my goddamn fantasy that I didn't realize it. When he said that they would never show anything that we were doing, it sounded believable. Even when it came to the cable show, he said they wouldn't show a married woman having an affair on national TV. I'd never seen it before, so it was believable. It wasn't until afterwards I realized the only reason they never showed anyone doing those things was because I was the first to do anything that stupid." She closed her eyes and a pained expression came over her. "When I watched those tapes with Dr. Royce, I realized just how wrong I was. I understood then how out of touch I was. She told me that I was a born narcissist. Basically, I'm the type of person that puts my needs ahead of all others and only looks out for my own self-gratification. The doctor figured that out, did she?" Kathy smiled for a moment. "But it was all on me, Sarah. Make no mistake that this entire mess was of my own making. Please don't think that anything I said here is an excuse. It's not. I knew better than to do what I did, but I was selfish and greedy, thinking could have it all." Sarah had something that needed to be said, something she'd been wanting to say for so long. "You hurt Dad so much, Mother. The first few years were absolutely horrible. He was depressed almost all of the time and would never even leave his apartment. I was in school, and he told me he'd disown me if I went down to Florida to help him. He had no one. Mother, you had a choice in doing what you did, but he didn't. Worse yet, he had to watch every second of you being seduced by not one, but two a-holes. Not to mention what Dad called pillow talk. You remember, admitting to other affairs while the entire country found out with him." Sarah was breathing hard now as she continued. "It was no picnic for me either, having to watch my mother making out with some guy, sometimes with friends in my room. But for Dad, you were the wife he loved. You were his life. Do you know how badly you have to hurt someone before they turn their back on someone they truly love? Do you? Tell me, did you ever love him?" Then she stopped, not knowing what else to say at the moment. Kathy's answer shocked Sarah. "I don't know. I don't know if I was ever in love with your father." Sarah gasped. "Dr. Royce said she had told your father that maybe I only liked the idea of being married to him, and looking back, I guess that's possible. I mean, I loved your father, but maybe I was never in love with your father, at least not in the degree he loved me. I'm certainly not proud of it, but it is certainly possible. I mean, how else can I explain all of the stupid things I've done to him? Can you believe that? I had a man as good as your father, and I didn't appreciate him enough to be his faithful wife. Funny thing is that part of the reason I cheated was because I thought your father was dull and boring, and now I would give anything to have him back in my life. That too is the narcissist in me coming out. Even though I may not truly love him, I want him back anyway because it's all about me. It's always all about me. As for your father being dull and boring, it's just his way, and that would be enough for most women. As for him not being around as much as I wanted him to be, there was a good reason for that. He was working hard to give his family a good life and being a great dad for his daughter, but I was too self-centered to see it that way. Oh, Sarah, you wouldn't believe how many times I considered showing up on your father's doorstep like I did yours today, just to tell him face to face how sorry I am. Sarah's jaw dropped. You took a chance with me, mother, but don't think for a minute that a meeting with dad would be anything other than a disaster. Kathy looked down to her lap as Sarah continued. Look, mother, he would never do anything to physically hurt you. It's just not in him, but I'm looking out for him. He's scarred more than you can ever imagine, and even though he's trying to move on with his life, it hasn't been easy for him. You showing up to chat isn't going to go over all that well, believe me. Kathy nodded, knowing her daughter was right. Sarah then asked with more than a hint of trepidation, Did you ever love me? Kathy had not expected her question, but true to her word, she answered honestly, Yes, but as with your dad, probably not as much as I should have. Don't forget I'm narcissistic. Dr. Royce pointed out that I always put my needs ahead of anyone else's. I no doubt did the same with you. Sarah cocked her head and Kathy could tell she was confused. Want an example? You saw the show in its entirety, right? Sarah nodded. Then you're already aware of the best example of my narcissism. The night of your prom. The night I bowed out and let your father go alone to chaperone, and all because I wanted to experience the excitement of sleeping with a neighbor. I did similar things in the past too, not to cheat, but I still put my needs before you or your father's. And to think, either of you would drop everything if I asked you to do something for me. Silence. Sarah eventually asked, Not sure if I really want to know the answer to this, but have you dated at all? I mean, aside from what we all saw on national television. Kathy rolled her eyes and said, I've been out on a few dates here and there, but they all think I'm easy, so my nights usually end early. She then quickly added, Gee, wonder where someone would get the idea I'm easy? Sarah smiled, thinking her mother had missed her calling and should have been a mind reader. Sarah changed direction a bit and said, Heard, world's watching. Had some problems. I mean the show. Kathy laughed a bit, but it was far from jolly. Turns out the producer's wife, Zach Blevin's wife, was cheating on him with a network executive and took him to the cleaners in a divorce. The network dropped him, and from what I hear, his career sank like the Titanic. He's still in the business, but I heard he was an associate producer of a morning show somewhere in the Midwest. Sarah nodded. I saw the show was canceled a couple of years later. Yeah, the fans of the show weren't about to accept what happened between a married woman and a couple of single guys. Most were actually appalled. Not being able to turn away from something like that, and condoning it turned out to be two totally different things. She then added, Before this all happened, I would have been appalled too. That's not too hypocritical, is it? Oh no, not at all, mother. It was killing Kathy that her daughter hadn't called her mom since before she left the house that fateful morning, although she understood why. Yet at this point she welcomed any kind of a relationship with Sarah, so the prim and proper mother title it would have to be. You know, I never saw myself bad person while all of this was going on, but I guess it's pretty hard to make that argument now, huh? And don't bother answering, it's a rhetorical question. Sarah wouldn't have had an answer anyway. Silence again filled the room. Finally Sarah said, Look, mother, I don't hate you. At least I don't think I do, but I do hate the things you did. I mean, I would have never in a million years thought you were capable of such treachery. Then we find out that there have been others. Sarah gathered her thoughts for a moment before adding, And how many more were there? You claimed on the show there were 2 others before then, but how many were there really? Kathy answered immediately, There were only the 2, sweetheart, I swear. But my swearing to it probably doesn't mean a whole lot anymore, does it? Honestly, no. But for some crazy reason I do believe you. Kathy then asked in a concerned tone that her daughter wouldn't have believed existed in her mother just an hour ago. How is he really, dear? Sarah took a deep breath and said, Dad is seeing someone. Is she anything like me? Sarah's expression changed into one of surprise and contempt and said, Jesus H. Christ, I hope not. Kathy felt like crawling into a hole and staying there. But she tried to recover after she realized what she asked. "Oh my God, I didn't mean it that way. I just meant, does she look anything like me?" "No, she's nothing like you. She's actually very nice." Kathy simply nodded at the less than subtle jab. Sarah asked, "You didn't think there was a chance between the two of you, did you?" "No, dear, I didn't, and I can honestly say I'm happy for him and wish him the best. I knew he would meet someone eventually." She just sniffled, and Sarah could see that hearing her father met someone took a lot out of her mother. She wasn't sure why, since she had him all to herself not so long ago and threw him away. Eventually, Kathy said, "Look, Sarah, I know I'll never get your father back, but I need to feel some love from part of my family. I crave it." Sarah could see her mother's fragile body vibrating as she tried to stave off tears. "I know I don't deserve to be loved, and God knows I don't have the right to ask for it, but I need it just the same. I don't expect to be forgiven. That train left the station a long time ago. As for everything being forgotten, not gonna happen, I know that. But I need to feel love. Just a little love." Kathy paused and looked down to her lap while her daughter just looked at the woman she used to love so much as she bared her soul. "I'm not evil. I know it seems like I am, and if that's what you and your father think, you both have every right in the world to do so. I was stupid. I was arrogant, self-centered, and selfish on a level that is totally unforgivable, but I still need a part of my family with me." Kathy paused for a moment before continuing. "Grandma and Grandpa have been there to help with the baby, but they and your aunt have pretty much kept their distance with me. 6 years and things are as strained between us as ever. As for everyone else, it's been beyond difficult. I know I brought this on myself, I truly do, but it's difficult to walk into a restaurant or the mall and have people recognize you and point and stare, or worse yet, direct a vulgar insult my way and get up and leave. I won't even begin to tell you how many death threats I've had." Sarah watched her mother's face contort with many different emotions at once, but grief and fear seemed to be leading the way. Grief over losing her daughter once, and fear that she would turn her back on her completely. "I know you're going to want your father around for holidays and such. I completely understood when you invited him to your graduation and wedding and not me. But please, Sarah, can you find it in your heart to have some kind of a relationship with me? I need you." Despite all that happened, Sarah was taking pity on her mother, but she wasn't about to kiss and make up anytime soon. Her pain ran too deep. Sarah then relented. "We could give it a try, but we'll have to take it slow. Truth is, I'm still pissed off. Not as much as Dad, of course, but pissed off just the same." Kathy just nodded. Sarah could see the fear in her mother's eyes that she might be totally rejected. At that moment, she feared for her mother's well-being. Sarah looked at her watch and then back to her mother and sighed. "I have to feed Stevie. Would you like to stick around and meet him?" Kathy broke down, but managed to somehow say, "I'd like that very much." When they stood up, Kathy asked, "The next time you see your father, could you please tell him I said hi?" "Sure, Mom." Kathy cried tears of joy after hearing Sarah call her mom. She had gone through 6 years of hell, all deserved. With this being the only bright spot since leaving the show, she was going to see her grandson for the first time and heard her daughter call her mom once again. Things might not work out in the long run, and her life was never going to be as it was before, but at least it was something. As they walked through the house, Sarah then asked, "So are you still in the same apartment?" "Yes. It's just right for the two of us. You know, your father was more than gracious with giving me the house and the bank accounts." Sarah rolled her eyes and said, "Be serious, Mother. Dad's a great guy and all, but he's not a saint. The only reason he gave up on just about everything he worked so hard for was because you hurt him so badly. He actually thought it was worth giving up everything just to get away from you. Let me tell you something, that's a world of hurt, don't you think?" Kathy nodded, not knowing what to say. She knew the reason why James gave up everything so easily, but to hear it from her daughter stung. Sarah picked up her baby and handed it to Kathy, who held on for dear life. She could feel little Stevie's unconditional love for her grandmother, and she could only hope he would still feel the same way when he gets older and hears the story of his grandmother's sins. James hears the doorbell and makes his way across the air-conditioned living room to the oppressive Florida heat and humidity that awaits on the other side of the front door. As the door swings inward, he sees her standing before him, looking just as beautiful as ever. Her smile was almost wider than her face, while her knees practically buckled in anticipation. Before James could say a word, she flung her arms around him as they both held on for dear life, neither wanting to be the first to break the embrace. Finally, they separate and James puts his hands on her shoulders to keep her at arm's length and says, "I almost forgot just how beautiful you are." She rolled her eyes and said, "Come on, Dad. You just saw me at Christmas. I know, Pumpkin. But that was almost 7 months ago. I'm just so glad you can spend a couple of weeks here. Where's your better half and my favorite grandson? He's getting Stevie in his stroller. I just couldn't wait to see you. She then looked into his eyes, thinking how good it was to see him smile again, and said, by the way, I talked to Mother and she says hi. He paused and said, well, tell her I said hi back. Really? Sarah asked while raising an eyebrow. Sure. Why not? His response surprised her. She had passed the same message on before, only to hear him say okay, or have him turn away without a word. Sarah smiled slyly and asked, so are you trying to say time heal all wounds? He brought his head up and replied, no. Now if you keep talking about it, I'll take back my elaborate return greeting. He paused for a moment, seemingly lost in his thoughts. Let's just change the subject, sweetie. Then he smiled some and added, by the way, Karen is going to eat with us tonight. Hope that's all right. I mean, I don't want to make dinner too uncomfortable, but you've said that you like Karen, so I didn't think there would be a problem. James just stood there with a goofy smile, and Sarah turned her head a bit and asked, why are you so happy? Then she squealed and said, oh my God, you asked Karen to marry you, didn't you? How the hell did you get that out of me saying Karen was coming over for dinner? She hugged him again and squeezed harder than ever. Because of your big doofus grin. Besides, it's a woman thing. You wouldn't understand it. So when did you ask her? Did she say yes? When's the wedding? Did you pick out a ring yet? Slow down, will you? For now, just save the date for the last weekend in September. Oh, Dad, I'm so happy for you. What made you decide to go for it? Still smiling, he replied, she wore me down. Karen's very convincing, you know? Then he added, I don't have the right to be this happy pumpkin. As she held on tight, she said, it's been 5 years since the divorce, Daddy. Let it go. Just let it go. You have every right to feel this happy. Besides, I hear the second time's a charm. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.